வாழ்க நிரந்தரம் வாழ்க தமிழ் மொழி வாழிய வாழியவே வானமளந்து அனைத்தும் அளந்திடும் வன்மொழி வாழியவே கடல் வைப்பினும் தன்மணம் வீசி இசை கொண்டு வாழியவே எங்கள் தமிழ் மொழி என்றென்றும் வாழியவே சூழ்களி நீங்க தமிழ் மொழியோங்க துளங்குக வையகமே தொல்லை வினை தரு தொல்லையன்று சுடர்க்கு தமிழ் நாடே வாழ்க தமிழ் மொழி வாழ்க தமிழ் மொழி வாழ்க தமிழ் மொழியே பாடமறிந்த தனைத்தும் அறிந்திடும் பலர்மொழி வாழியவே பலர்மொழி வாழியவே பலர்மொழி வாழியவே.
And next, I would like to invite Mr. Velayadu Pillai on behalf of the Tamil Coalition for a welcome address.
Distinguished guests and dear friends, on behalf of the organizing team consisting of Tamil Genocide Memorial, United Tamil Solidarity Front, Quebec Tamil Development Association, Ottawa Tamil Association, Canadian Tamil Coalition for Justice and Accountability, Tamil Canadian Center for Civic Action, the Tulf People Cultural Organization of Canada, and Brampton Tamil Association. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this important conference held at a very critical period of our struggle for survival as an ancient community. I wish to extend a very special welcome to our speakers who accepted our invitation and agreed to present their views on topics that are of vital significance to all Tulan Tamil. I wish to extend a cordial welcome to all our participants from different countries and continents, and we sincerely appreciate the sacrifice you make for a noble cause. Many of us are going through different forms of constraints due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Most of you joining today are Tamil activists and human rights defenders, eager to learn and understand the complexity of challenges the Tamil community faces. We appreciate the time and effort you put into it. After 2009, Tamil Diaspora is calling for a Nuremberg-like tribunal to prosecute and hold prominent members of political, military, judicial, and economic leadership of the government of Sri Lanka accountable for the crimes of genocide. The international community has denied justice for the horrific events of May 2009, failing to deliver any tangible remedies to the Tamil community. Instead, the international community continues to silence and suppress Tamil diaspora voices through a criminal counterterrorism lens by extending the listing of the Ltte unfairly. As indicated by the title of our conference, namely Tamil Liberation Struggle for Self-Determination, 20 years after the ceasefire agreement, the necessity for delisting of the Ltte, the protection of Tamil rights, and the destigmatization of global Tamil diaspora, we have two important themes: self-determination and the recovery of Tamil rights. We have an eminent panel of speakers who will help us to explore the frontier of these themes and other issues embodied in this long title of our conference. Each aspect of it is essential for us to understand and to deepen our resolve to secure our rights as a community. As Tamil diaspora, we need to distinguish between what is important and what is urgent and plan to achieve our goal in solidarity. We believe this conference will help us prioritize the Tamil diaspora future work. Thank you.
Thank you for the welcome address. As you all know, this is a two-day session, and I would like to start off today's session by introducing Mr. Rudra Kumaran Visuvanathan, who is the Prime Minister of the Transnational Government of Tamil Nadu, which aims to realize accountability for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes committed by Sri Lanka against the Tamil nation, and to create a separate Tamil homeland. The only way Tamils can protect their rights, called Tamilism in the island of Sri Lanka. He was the former legal advisor to the Liberation Tigers of Tamilism. By profession, he is a lawyer in United States. The topic that he will be discussing is terrorist designation is the continuation of politics by other means. The floor is yours, Mr. Rudra Kumaran Vishwanath.
Thank you. Holding the sacred memories of our Mahavira, who waged an armed campaign in accordance with international law and moral principles to realize the Tamils' inherent right to self-determination in the form of an independent and sovereign state of Tamilism, I share my thoughts. I also take this opportunity to congratulate the organizers for putting forth this webinar. War is the continuation of politics by other means, said one Clausewitz, a military general, a military theorist in the 19th century. War is a phenomenon associated with changing relationship between parties or among parties. As we see today, Putin's threat to use force
I think we have lost video connection there.
He got muted, so I asked him to unmute.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, as we see today, Putin's threat of use of force is nothing but a ploy to realize his political objective. It seems to me he might achieve that political goal without resorting to war just by the threat of use of force. So we see the political consideration in the designation of foreign entities as foreign terrorist organizations and the process of the means of it. It is very visible. Recently, it is very visible in the US. During the Black Lives Matter protest, former President Trump tweeted that he is going to designate Antifa. This is a group. It's a small group of people who are interested in the blacks' rights, who never carries arms. But he tweeted that he is going to designate this Antifa group as a terrorist organization. Then he designated a white supremacist group in Russia as a foreign terrorist organization. Presently, we hear calls from the liberals to designate the far right group in the US as terrorist organizations. And I wouldn't be surprised that tomorrow if Canada designate the Truckers Association, if they are saying, as a terrorist organization. Because what the authorities are doing is they use this terrorism label to achieve their political goal. This by using this to label the message they are giving to the public at large, that this particular entity, this particular organization, or the views espoused by these other entities are not acceptable. As former US National Intelligence Director Mr. James Clapper once observed, that the primary value of designating foreign entities as terrorist organization is symbolic. So we have to take that into bearing in mind, and we take what the designation of LTT. The designation of LTT and the means of designating the LTT as a foreign terrorist organizations are highly political. The first time LTT was designated as a foreign terrorist organization, or for the first time it was characterized as a foreign terrorist organization, if to my knowledge, is in 1996 by Canada in the with respect to the removal proceedings of the then WTM coordinator, Mr. Suresh Manikavasa. Canada initiated the proceedings, charged him that he was engaged in terrorism. What they meant by that he was engaged in fundraising for the LTT, and then he was a member of an organization engaged in terrorism. So it was a special proceedings. It was called 40.1 proceedings. So then the proceedings took, actually we used, LTT used that proceedings as a forum to legitimize its call, its armed struggle, to put forward its sides of the story. So experts from across the globe came and testified. If I remember, Professor Boyle came and testified, Professor Richard Paul came and testified, Professor Karen Parker, experts across the globe came and testified about the Tamil struggle and the legitimacy of the Tamil struggle. If I remember correctly, it went nearly 50 days. So the main argument was put forward by the experts that the right to self-determination is not only applicable in colonial context, but also is applicable in non-colonial context. So it is applicable in the context of the Tamil struggle. And the recipient unit of the right to self-determination, based on the international court decisions of the International Court of Justice, Western Sahara case, Namibia case, and if you analyze the previous recipient unit of the right to self-determination, they identify three elements that constitute people who are entitled to the right to self-determination. One is they should have an objective characteristic such as distinct language, distinct religion, distinct culture. Second, there should be a subjective factor, the oneness, sameness, sense of solidarity, real will, etc. Then they should have a relationship to a defined territory. Based on this, the experts testify that the Tamil people are entitled to the right to self-determination. Then they also, based on the resolution, General Assembly Resolution 2625, which is considered as a customary international law, they also argue that the right to self-determination can be exercised in various forms, including in an independent state. This we put forward this argument in 1996. In 1998, the Canadian Supreme Court, with respect to Quebec decision, said the same thing. I am not insinuating that the Canadian Supreme Court plagiarized our brief, but I am saying it in order to demonstrate the legal validity of the argument of this court, citing the Canadian Supreme Court decision with respect to Quebec. So then we argue that if you agree that this is a struggle for self-determination, that it falls under the purview of Article 1.4 of 1977 Additional Protocol, which considered that the armed struggle for a right to self-determination should be perceived as an international armed conflict, and the laws of war should be applicable. So our argument was at that time that since it falls within the Article 1.4 of Additional Protocol, international law are the one that governs the conduct of the members. Therefore, they are not subject to domestic laws of Canada. Then Canada brought an expert. Canada brought an expert from UK. They brought Professor Christopher Greenwood. He was at that time a professor at the London School of Economics. Then he became a judge of the International Court of Justice. So he came and he provided testimony also. He provided testimony. As we expected, he gave a very conservative view of the laws of war and the right to self-determination. But he acknowledged that the General Assembly Resolution 2625 has become a customary international law, and that is applicable. But he disputed that the addition of Article 1.4 of Additional Protocol 1, he said it has not crystallized, so has not evolved as a customary international law. Then our response at the time was, it doesn't matter. Whether it has become a customary international law or not, it doesn't matter. Our argument is, because Canada is a party to the Additional Protocol 1, And through Canada's Geneva Convention Act, it has become part of the domestic law, so it is applicable. But what the judge said, he said he's not going to rule on that issue. He did not rule on that issue. Probably he must have thought it is a political question or what, but he said, no, I am not going to rule on this issue. And then he said he was not going to get into the details of what constitutes terrorism. But then he said, but the acts, when you see it, you can judge it whether it's an act of terrorism or not. So he said attack on civilian. He cited a couple of cases and said that because this is sufficient to sustain the Home Secretary's certificate of removal. So this what happened in Canada. This happened in 1996. Today it is 2022, and I must tell you happily and proudly, Mr. Suresh Manikavasam still in Canada. There we go to the next. This happened in 1997. The decision came in 1997, October 8th. The US designated Ltte as a foreign terrorist organization. So at that time, because I remember the dates very well, because Suresh Manikavasam's decision came on July 29, 1997, because July 29 is the date the Indo-Sri Lankan Accord was signed. So that came on July 29, 1996, and then, 97, and the US designated Ltte as a terrorist organization, put it on the list on October 8, 1997. So at that time, personally, I was not very inclined to challenge the designation, but the leadership wanted to challenge the designation. Because the leadership was cognizant of well aware that when it comes to terrorism or foreign relations, normally the courts tend to defer to the government. That they are very well aware of. In spite of this, so they said, it doesn't matter whether we win or lose. We will challenge it because we'll use it as a forum. We'll use it as a forum to tell our side of the story and gain legitimacy for it. So Ltte challenged the designation. And former US Attorney General, Mr. Ramsey Clark, he was the lead attorney on behalf of the Ltte in this legal challenge. If you look at the US definition of for FT or foreign terrorist organization, there should be three elements in order to constitute a foreign terrorist organization. First, it should be a foreign organization. Second, it must have engaged in terrorist activity. Third, it poses a threat to US national security or the security of US nationals. So even if these three criteria are met, only that particular organization can be designated as a foreign terrorist organization. But I want to also say one thing with respect to the terrorist activity. That particular clause is studied with an exception. If you do it for a monetary gain, it's okay. So I thought it's kind of a reaffirmation of our fidelity to capitalism. Then during that period, there was a forum on this on the Patriot Act, and I was also one of the panelists. So I stated this position in my presentation. And there was a panelist from the US State Department legal office. Then he said, no, the reason why the monetary gain exception was put, he said that if you're engaging in violent activities for monetary gain, is covered under the normal criminal law provision of robbery or burglary. So that's the reason that monetary gain exception was put forward. Anyway, so then we'll come to the argument that we raised. First, Ltte argued that it is not a foreign organization. We argued that Ltte is a de facto government. Therefore, it doesn't falls within the purview of this FTO laws. Secondly, we argue, based on the international law principles, self-defense, self-help, and specifically on the right to realize the right to self-determination, Ltte has the right to use force. Number three, then we argue that Ltte is not a threat to US security or not a threat to any country's security. Ltte, in fact, wants to have a friendly relationship with all nations in the world. So these are the crux of the arguments put forward. So the court said, whether it is a de facto government or whether it is a foreign organization, that question should be decided by the Secretary of State. They said that is a political question. We do not have expertise to decide, so we leave that to the state, to the Secretary of State. With respect to the question whether LTT constitutes a threat to the US security or national, they said that question is also a political question. We leave it to the Secretary of State. We are not going to say anything on that. So out of 3 criteria, 2 criteria, they say no, they cannot decide on it. They simply defer whatever the Secretary of State says. With respect to the national liberation argument and the engaging in terrorist activity, again, the US court also, they found there was an evidence, there was an attack on a police station. So they said attack on a police station cannot be classified as a legitimate military activity in an armed conflict. That particular attack constitutes a terrorist activity. So that is sufficient to sustain the designation, designation of LTT as a terrorist organization. So even though we lost in the court of law, we thought it was a moral victory for us because we exposed that the whole the designation of foreign terrorist organization exercise is nothing but a political act. You are using the law to try to gain legitimacy for a political act. So then we filed a petition for rehearing, arguing that the Secretary of State is using the court to gain legitimacy through getting a judicial imprimatur for a political decision, and that violates the very integrity of the judiciary itself. So we made that argument, but we did not prevail on that argument. So then that was only that's the only only challenge we found in the US. But then after what happened, even after the LTT has silenced its guns in 2009, it is being routinely renewed. So the last designation expired in August of 2021. In May of 2021. July of 2021, the TGT, we filed a petition with the Secretary of State asking him not to renew the LTT as a foreign terrorist organization, because the key point in the law is whether it is presently engaged in terrorist activity. That is the key part of the law. So our position is since 2009, it has been the guns have been silent. There are no military activities whatsoever. So it should not be renewed. And the designation expires in this August. But thus far, the State Department has not made any decision. So technically speaking, LTT is not on the list. But in the US, we have 3 tiers of terrorist organization. One is the tier 1, that's where the Secretary of State puts it on the list. Tier 2, the Treasury Department put it on the list. And tier 3, that you don't have to put it on the list. If 2 people are engaging in violent activities, that is sufficient to say that the organization is a foreign terrorist organization. But regarding the first one, thus far, the Secretary of State has not made any decision. Then we go to India. In India, LTT is banned, not because LTT is engaged in any terrorist activity. The reason LTT is banned in India alleges that LTT is a threat to India's territorial integrity. They got some old map from unknown source that talks about Greater Tamil Nadu, and they are still arguing, saying that, well, LTT is a threat to India's territorial integrity. That's the argument they are making. They are not making any argument, even though they are making press reports. They arrest some people who are trying to revive LTT, so forth. Their main argument in the court that LTT is a threat to India's territorial integrity. It is a political argument. Argument if it is true. The proper way to respond to that, to have a political engagement, you mark in the marketplace of idea, you put forward your idea and say why India should remain as one as it is now. That is the proper way to handle political debate. But what the authorities are doing, they are using law to advance political goal, to advance their politics, naked politics. That's what is happening all over the world. So anyway, then we challenge that one also. TGT challenge, I also challenge personally. So the court said that our main argument is LTT's goal is a establishment of an independent state. Our goal, TGK's goal, is an establishment of an independent state. So because of this terrorist designation of the Ltte, there is a chilling effect on our advocacy work by the people in India. That is true. Whenever we have any webinar or any meetings in India, the first thing they say, please remove the ban. They say, if you remove the ban, only we can do any work in Tamil Nadu. So we put all those things and we filed a petition asking the tribunal to nullify the ban. Then the government came and argued. They did not argue on the merits. That's what we do, because since 1990, it has been routinely challenged by many people. Vaiko has challenged, Mr. Nadumaran has challenged, a lot of people have challenged. Last time, we also challenged. So what the government said, TGT is not banned in India. TGT can come and do any kind of political work they want, and the personal Rudrakumaran can come and do any kind of political work in India. Therefore, they don't have standing, because in legal, if you are going to challenge something, that's one of the important things. You have to first establish standing. You have to show that how this law affects you. Then only you can pursue the case. This is a preliminary thing. So what the government came and they did not argue on the merits. They argue these people have no right to challenge the ban. So the tribunal agreed with them, dismissed the case. Now we are now in the process of filing an appeal, saying no, we have standing because it affects this ban, affects our political work. So that's where it's happening. Then we come to UK. UK also they routinely just renew the ban. So the last time then we challenged it. Okay. Initially we got a victory on a procedural ground. The tribunal said that procedurally it was wrong. So they vacated not vacated, they said it was misstated. Then they send it back because the government argued if the court makes a decision that it was that the procedure was flawed, then please send it back to the Secretary of State and give her another opportunity to make a new decision. But again, as expected, she cited 3 incidents because they have to prove that something happened recently. They cannot say Ltte did that and this in 2004, 1990. They cannot do that now. They have to come up with some recent events. So they came up with some 3 incidents. Those 3 incidents, to be honest with you, it was news to me. I didn't even know those things happened. They cited 3 incidents. There was a cyber attack, cyber attack of the Sri Lankan mission in Kerala. And they arrested, and there's another person was arrested, or he died while he was being caught. He was a former Ltte member trying to make bomb. And they arrested a lady in the bus in a hand. He was carrying a handbag, and the handbag there was also bomb. So these 3 incidents, and these are incidents given by the Sri Lankan government, not by an independent source. This is the party to the conflict who wants to keep the Ltte on the list. So the UK Secretary of State rely on that, and she has extended the ban, renewed the ban. So we challenge it again. The case is currently pending in the UK tribunal. So as what I say, I have shown you, the whole thing is nothing but politics. And and also sometimes when you read their reasons or rationales given by the authorities, I was left dumbfounded because in one of the Canadian cases, Suresh Manikawa's case says that if Suresh Manikawa wins, then they will Diaspora will celebrate. Then it will be a victory for Ltte. These kind of arguments.
Mr. Rudrakumar, yeah, we are running out of time, but you can sum it up in
I'll sum it up. Okay, yeah, I want to sum it up. So that's what, but even though we know it's a political decision, we have to challenge it. So in fact, we consider our litigation. Our litigation is also a continuation of the politics by other means. The mode of struggle is changed. The modus operandi is changed, but the goal remains the same. The struggle continues. Tamil's destiny in Tamil's hand. The thirst of Tamils is Tamil.
Thank you, Mr. Rudrakumaran. For the great this talk. We will be moving on to the next segment. There's a slight change in the schedule. We will be moving to Ms. Abhinanimo, who is recently completed her master's in peace and conflict studies from the University of Waterloo and aspires to continue her work in the realm of human rights and conflict resolution. Coming from an Elam Tamil family, she strongly believes that remedial justice and reconciliation is necessary for our brothers and sisters back home in Tamil Elam. The title for her speak will be The Impact of Listing LTTE on Tamil Youth and Their Future Pursuits.
Good evening, and thank you to the organizing committee for holding this conference on a necessary topic to fight for justice for Ulam Tamils. And as lawyer Rudrav Kumar Vishwanathan had critically examined the terrorist label prescribed to the LTT, outlining how it came to be and how it continues to step into the political front even years after, just solidifies how important it is for us to discuss on these issues and work towards eradicating them. So today I'd like to present on how the LTT listing is affecting youth specifically. And so I'd like to analyze the impact the listing has had on Tamil youth and their future pursuits by focusing on three major events that took place in Canada. And I'll concentrate on how the political labeling and globalization of the Sri Lankan conflict to be seen on a war on terror has impacted the Tamil youth politically, legally, and socially. So the Sri Lankan government labeling of the LTT as a terrorist organization manipulated the focus of the war. The terrorist label was often affiliated with the Tamil population of Sri Lanka, even in the 1970s, when the Tamil militant groups took part in small-scale attacks. So validating the terrorist label, the Sri Lankan government brought into effect the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which permitted arrest for unspecified, unlawful activities without warrant and permits detention for up to 18 months without authorities producing the suspect before court pre-trial. And so this was written in ambiguous terms, allowing the government to arbitrarily detain Tamil civilians and peaceful activists to put them through brutal treatment, to imprison them under false allegations. While arbitrarily detaining innocent civilians through the PTA, state-enforced security forces to also fire in no-fire zones and physically tortured several Tamil women and men. And despite the knowledge of this, the international community and civil society actors remained hesitant to support a group with a terrorist label, especially after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States. Global focus, with specific to the Western world, became heavily focused on anti-terror initiatives, which ultimately weakened the LTT's legitimacy. And so the systematic incorporation of the terrorism into the Sri Lankan political discourse had globalized to shift the focus of the war. Most diaspora Tamils who saw the LTT as their sole representative in the state also promoted their stance on the conflict in their host countries through various means of lobbying, including protests, demonstrations, and through diaspora-run media outlets. But its mediation-seeking international aid was limited and inefficient due to the existing political label. So when using the rhetoric of terrorism, it's important to understand the consequences and power of it. There are many negative implications with listing groups or people as terrorists, as it discredits them, dehumanizes them, and categorizes them as people who cannot be reasoned with. And in all this, the history and root causes to their grievances are ignored, diverts attention away from the existing problematic policies with the current system, and denies space for negotiation. So as such, the listing of the LTT as a terrorist organization has had impeding effects on Tamil citizens. Even after the defeat of the LTT in May 2009, the existing listing continues to distort the perception of who Tamils are, labeling them as terrorists. Especially the Tamil youth have seen to be radicalized as violent individuals. Canada's Anti-Terrorism Act had prescribed the LTT as a terrorist organization in April 2006. The European Union had also done so when it was in the midst of participating in an internationally brokered peace process with the government of Sri Lanka, with legal recognition as a recognized entity. And as a consequence of this, Tamils in Canada grew victims of racial profiling, targeting, discrimination, oppression, and importantly, racialized as terrorists. So legally, the Canadian courts began racialization against Tamils as early as the 1990s, as We heard from lawyer Richard Kumaran in the case of Suresh versus Canada. And so for background, Suresh Manikavasan was the leader of the World Tamil Movement, which was legally registered as a charitable body under Canadian law that had been operating for 22 years, providing various services, including settlement, cultural, and social services. The Suresh versus Canada case came to an end in 2002 in the Supreme Court of Canada with the decision known as the Suresh exception. Here, going against Canada's international legal obligation to the principle of non-refoulement, Mr. Suresh's case legalized the deportation of a non-citizen where there was a possible threat of torture as it was in the interest of national security. Rather than obliging to secure Mr. Suresh, who was at a threat of torture if deported, he was racialized as a terror to public safety. Mr. Suresh's identity as a Tamil man, supporting a nationalist cause, a member of the Tamil community, and holding a prominent position within the World Tamil Movement was sufficient to rule him as a member of a terrorist organization. And ironically, as compared to other security certificate cases, Mr. Suresh's case did not depend on the warrant of a criminal or violent act, but rather based on racial profile. So Canada's listing altered the perception of organizing initiatives taken by the Tamil community, making them criminalized and labeled them as terrorist activities. Standing out as one of the many cases, the Suresh versus Canada is a prominent example to identify how the listing of the Ltte impeded on the investigation process legally and encouraged the labeling of the entire Tamil community as terrorists. Another significant event demonstrating these negative consequences of the Ltte listing on Tamil youth specifically is the May 2009 protest that took place in Toronto on the Gardner Expressway. The protesters who gathered here during the last phase of the armed conflict were demanding the Canadian and international intervention to establish a ceasefire in Sri Lanka with the mass reporting of Tamil civilian deaths. What was perceived from this event by the Canadian authorities, media, and even Western observers were the endanger to public safety, concern for the safety of children, and the presence of women and children who were accompanying the blockage created at the protest. In doing so, the intent of the protest on gaining attention towards the mass killing of Tamil civilians was ignored and rather used as an opportunity to continue racialize and label the Tamil diaspora youth as terrorists. And ironically, the real threat to safety this day was the enforcement of 100 armed police forces at the protest threatening to use tear gas. Responding to the officials' concerns on the safety of children and women, this was the exact argument put forth by the hundreds and thousands of protesters who had gathered on the Gardner Expressway demanding intervention to safeguard the innocent civilians being killed. Since the prescription of the Ltte as a terrorist organization in 2006, the entire Tamil community was racialized and labeled, leading them to be criticized for voicing out their concerns through such protests. The terrorism label became an acceptable term to reference the Tamil community with. Even media representations were seen using the us and them dynamic, setting apart the Tamils who were labeled as terrorists apart from the rest of the nation. Such racialization against Tamils increased surveillance of Tamil youth. This event raises an important question for us to note when studying the impact of the rhetoric of terrorism, questioning whose lives actually matter. The intensifying views of the Tamil community as terrorists had also resulted in Tamils being denied basic protections of political rights. And in that case, the MV Ocean Lady in October 2009 and the MV Sansi in August 2010 were two ships carrying Tamils fleeing the Sri Lankan Civil War to Canada. While many organizations, including the Canadian Council for Refugees, Amnesty International Canada, and the Canadian Tamil Congress requested to respect the rights of the passengers as a response to the terrorist label automatically being given to the asylum seekers on the ship, the Canadian government's response was rather contradictory. In both cases, media and officials were quick to identify the passengers as illegal immigrants, human smugglers, and terrorists, leading to intense inquiries and the detention of the refugees who arrived on the ship, when in reality, these were just survivors of the genocide. So the rhetoric of terrorism here again became tied to gender norms as well, where women and children were given lenience and given a family image, where men were merely seen as members of families, but rather seen as individuals, thus holding a higher level of threat. Those who arrived on both the Sansi and the Ocean Lady were faced with various difficulties in attaining a refugee status, as the Canadian government had put forth inconceivable policies and legislations in place, identifying them as people smugglers, which complicated the process for the Tamil asylum seekers. So these three cases put together outline how the rhetoric of terrorism has had and continues to have a deep scar on the identity of the Tamil community. Tamil activism and community organizing continues to be perceived with the potential threat of violence and risk due to the existing listing of the Ltte as a terrorist organization. So rather than labeling and racializing Tamil, the more effective approach to this issue would be to examine the impact of such targeting on Tamils instead of scholars focusing their studies on the so-called identity crisis the Tamil diaspora, more specifically Tamil youth face, and being separated from their home country and settling in their host nation. So it's important to question here what the root causes of these issues are. The blunt reality is that the Sri Lankan government fought against its own citizens, and the Sri Lankan government has been reluctant to respond to the international intervention regarding these allegations simply by putting forth an argument of counterterrorism. It's an undeniable fact that the listing of the Ltte terrorist organization has hampered the Tamil community. There's a blanket that all Tamils are terrorists. Media and officials continue to target Tamil youth groups in schools and Tamil student associations at various universities through revoking their status and restricting the use of Tamil language and the Tamil liberation flag. In a 2010 report released by the International Crisis Group titled The Sri Lankan Tamil Diaspora After the Ltte, this report had focused towards identifying faults in the Tamil's continued demand for a separate state. Where a major concern I found was the report was constantly radicalizing the diaspora of Tamil youth. So civil society organizations and academic research continues to radicalize and racialize Tamil youth as terrorists. Scholarly research and media representation needs to be altered to set aside the sociological factors differentiating against Tamil. The attention needs to be given towards understanding the impact the listing has had on Tamil youth as opposed to immediately labeling them as terrorists. So I'd like to end up here by stating that it's important to work towards the delisting of the Ltte to remove the racialization, radicalization, and discrimination Tamils continue to face, and to eliminate the barriers the terrorist label has forced Tamil youth to continue to face till date today. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech, Ms. Vinanimal. Next, we have with us Mr. Chandra and Kopinath, who is the Tamilnet founder based in Oslo, Norway, and has been covering the peace process related interviews. He was in touch with the Tamil leaders who were involved in the peace talks during the Norwegian facilitated peace process. And one of the few editorial witnesses with internal insight and access to the Tamil side, having interacted with all the Ltte leaders involved in the peace process. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Kopinath. His title for speech today would be The Peace Trap, the Tamil dilemma of peacemaking while confronting the peace-building narratives of counterinsurgency and geopolitics of the international community. The moral responsibility of the Canadian Tamil diaspora in course correcting the narrative. Mr. Chandra? Yeah.
Yes, hello. Could you please enable me to share the screen? Post disabled participant screen sharing.
Let me see. Can we share the screen, please?
What was his ID?
Yeah.
Okay, now you can.
Yes. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we see you screen.
Great. Hello and vanakkam. I have some back pain, so I have to stand up and present. So I am going to switch off my video here, and hope you all are able to see my computer screen. Yeah.
Yes, we can see that.
வாருங்கள் எல்லோரும் வடம் பிடிப்போம், போராட்ட தேரை இழுத்தங்கள், தேசத்தை விடுவிப்போம் என்று தேசக்கவி புதுவை ரத்தினதுரை சொன்னார். Come on everybody, pull the rope of the chariot of the struggle, liberate our nation. புதுவை ரத்தினதுரை, the poet of the nation. He was subjected to enforced disappearance at the hands of the Sri Lankan military, last seen on 18th May 2009. The peace trap. The dilemma of the Tamils has always been making choices between what is pragmatic, as described from an Orientalist outside both theoretical perspective, and what is regarded as the absolute minimum irreversible guarantee to secure their collective rights in order to protect their existence as a people, nation, with equal rights as that of the Sinhalese in the island. Navigating the complex matrix full of such dilemmas is an area where Tamils need to excel. The topic we are discussing today is the peace trap. I have chosen the title Tamil Dilemma of Peacemaking while convincing the pragmatics of the global society and confronting the peace building narratives of the state-centric and geopolitics-induced counter-insurgency and counter-terrorism paradigms. Canada is a diasporic home to the largest number of exiled Elam Tamils who fled genocidal onslaught in their traditional homeland, which is the northern and eastern parts of the island of Sri Lanka. The Tamil people in Canada look up to the host country as their second homeland, where they have integrated with dignity and equality, an opportunity rejected to them for decades by the predominant ethno-national group in their original land, where the main group, Sinhala Theravada Buddhists, falsely claim the island as their chosen island, according to the religious Mahavamsa doctrine, which was chronicled in 5th century CE with biased myths. Since this conference is about the Canadian responsibility, the second part of the topic is to look at the moral responsibility of the Elam Tamils in Canada and shed some light on how they could contribute positively to course correct the narratives that affect the Tamil struggle, with particular focus on the state responsibility of Canada and the role of the Canadian civil society. So let us look at the peace trap first. Although the peace process officially started on 22nd February 2002, we need to look at the developments both in the island and outside since 1996. You will understand why I say 1996 as we proceed with this presentation. So from 1997 to 1998, Operation JC Krui, it was May 1997 it started, and Ltte proscribed as the FTO in the USA in August that year, 1997. Ltte's unceasing waves succeeded in May 1998, a year after the Operation JC Krui. And after 1998, particularly in India, there was a BJP rule, as it is now, ruled by Vajpayee. Indirect backing for peace process was obtained in 2001, 2002 from India during the Vajpayee time. LTT's paradigm-changing military victories marked 2000 and 2001. And in 2001, we have a genuine peace-making effort. From 2002 to 2003, US-UK seized the process through the so-called Tokyo co-chairs. And LTT was pressurized, but LTT manages to place a proposal, interim self-governing authority. From 2000 to 2004, we witnessed Kumaratunga sacking Ranil ministers, Karuna split, regime change in India. Now we have J and Dixit managing the Indian part from India, also the peace process indirectly. And then we have the tsunami. In 2005, Sivaram's assassination in April, P. Toms was nullified. Kadir Gamar assassination comes in August. EU travel ban in September. And Canada bans the LTT in April 2006. EU bans the LTT in May. EU had a travel ban earlier. From 2007 to 2008, we see the collapse of the CFA and the genocidal war begins. In 2009, war was waged as a genocidal onslaught. US provides key intelligence to the Sri Lankan military. From 2009 to 2020, US continues port visits to, let us go to the other. US provides key intel to the SL military, and then we have Colombo tilting toward China, US-India strategic partners. And then you have 2013 to 2020, Xi Jinping becomes China's leader. And then you have the BRI project launched. And then you have 2013, US Navy port visits to Trincomalee, Operation Balanced Style, again in 2020. We had the same Operation Balanced Style in 1996 in the South, when the US started to give military assistance to Sri Lanka. And again in 2020, the same operation, as also before in 2001, also they had this Operation Balanced Style. Hambantota port deal with Sri Lanka was done in the Ranil's time, and then you have Geopolitical Balancing Act again, nowadays, from 2020 to 2022. Dealings with the US, India, and China, accompanied by Colombo and China's Bullying Act. So you see Balancing Act and Bullying Act on the ground. So this is how the events are marked. So when you look at the events that unfolded during the peace process, it is clear that the role of the US and the US-India geopolitics, Sri Lankan counter-insurgency campaign against the Tamil struggle, and the global counter-terrorism paradigm were all jointly working together in the case of the Elam Tamils. Also, their diaspora, all were operating to crush the Tamil struggle for independence. So US counter-insurgency, how was it operating? Here we are looking at a Master of Science study by Robert J. Connor, captain of the US States Army, a research paper from June 2002. For the he describes 4 elements as key factors. 1, unity of effort, maximum use of intel. minimum use of violence, and a responsive government. Look at this. For the government of Sri Lanka, LTT can be best described as internal defense and development problem, IDAD, according to him. So he was turning the counterinsurgency manual of the USA when giving the 4 key points for success. And then categorizing the Sri Lankan military's role in different periods, he points out success only after 1996. As I already said, the peace process needs to be looked from 1996 onwards. The year when US military started to assist the Sri Lankan military actively with training on the ground, Operation Balanced Style. Already before the commencement of the peace talks, this command implies that the Sri Lankan military is set ready to confront the LTTE. Look at 96, 2001, and 2001 and 2002 in the table. But the ground reality, as we looked in the chronology before, was much different. With LTT routing Jayasikrui, EPS victory in 2000, Katunayak operation, and the peace process starting. So military was prepared well ahead of the peace process. How was the diaspora situation at that time? The US defense related public research outfit, the RAND Corporation, came with a key publication in 2001, I think, titled Trends in Outside Support for Insurgent Movements. Here, the Tamil diaspora and the case of the LTT became a key subject. The book is still available online for download. You should download it and read it in full to understand how counterinsurgency narratives and counter-terror narratives and the diaspora context were working together. And then an article from 2007 on La Chapelle crackdown and the role of the diaspora, an article by Joel Demers. It should also be available online. La Chapelle crackdown, governments have attempted to curb diaspora involvement in war by freezing assets of individuals and organizations. And then on a much smaller scale, peace building NGOs have targeted diasporas as potential peace builders and have looked at for ways to transform hoax into doors. Note the terminology, hoax into doors. Over the past decade, a range of diaspora dialogues have been set up, many of which failed. Engaging diaspora communities in peace processes. This is a publication of the US-based global pro bono outfit, which was known as PILPG in March 2009. But this group was also involved in 2002 peace process. It was providing simulations to LTTE negotiators and negotiating team and to the Sri Lankan negotiating team, training them in peacemaking or peace building, as they call it. So in that document, the Tamil diaspora has a well-established, this is from 2009, has a well-established network of media and broadcast sources through which they disseminate information on Tamils and the conflict. Such sources include daily, weekly, monthly, and quarterly publication of Tamils and the conflict. A strong presence online in large organizations including TamilNation.org, TamilNet.com, and Tamil language shows. So how do they view these media outlets? Tamil Nation and Tamilnet, two popular Tamil diaspora websites, published critical commentaries of the conference, arguing that the conference had failed to adequately include all interested parties in the Sri Lankan diaspora. Tamil Nation and Tamilnet expressed concerns that the Sri Lankan diaspora was not prepared to recognize the Tamils and instead sought to assimilate the Tamils rather than recognize their interest resolving conflict. In addition, Tamilnet suggested that to the conference, the organizers sought to intimidate portions of the diaspora. This is about a Malaysian conference that was talked about a lot at that time. And these publications are also important. International Crisis Group played a vital role in waging a war against the diaspora and also looping in several Tamil diaspora groups into their fold and individuals, activists, so-called activists, and change them from hawks to doves. You also have this Human Rights Watch document, Funding the Final War. It was issued before 2009. So these should also be read in context to understand how the diaspora was being dealt with. Then we have certain diaspora and homeland engagement projects, which went on in Switzerland, organized by the NGOs, and also supported by the state-funded Zurich initiative. This is also about turning hawks into doves. Nowadays, the foreign ministry that deals with certain diaspora initiatives has taken the name Human Security Division within the foreign ministry to deal the diaspora. Many other countries may have similar approach. There are also development divisions within the foreign ministries that engage with the Tamil diaspora. Some attempts, as the one we see here, Vienna Woods Group, seem to be neutral, but you never know. So let us look the mention of the Zurich link and then their final statement. Particularly, this is about a roadmap. So I am going to the next slide to describe it. The Canadian model is being talked about here. In which context it's being talked about? There are three separate. I will highlight all the three. The first one, the system, they talk about the Indian model. But first try Indian model, but it seems like Indian model, but it is in fact proposing to build on the existing 13th Amendment, although it is saying the Indian model. Suggestion to remove the concurrent list and removal of emergency from the Constitution. And then if that fails, they suggest the Canadian model to hold a referendum for separation if the right to internal self-determination as provided under this system is violated. Then finally, if it also doesn't work, the establishment of an independent state. So the third option is given to lock the diaspora groups into accepting the 13th Amendment model. Because they say the internal Canadian model would be the point 2 in the roadmap if the first one fails. So politically, the hawks are turned into doves. Why I say this? The problem with this proposal is a failure or the intended failure, because it suggests internal self-determination. This is exactly we did before 1977. For 30 years, we were trying internal self-determination based model. So they are asking to reinvent the wheel. by doing so, they want us to get locked, as I said, into the 13th Amendment model under a unitary system. So we will see more details on that later if we have enough time. What's going on in the UN Human Rights Council? Since October 2006, during the past 15 years, it was not known to many people these days that the first resolution on Sri Lanka, a draft resolution which was not passed, was presented on 7th October 2006 at the second session after the first session, the initial first session of the UN Human Rights Council. So for the whole life of the Human Rights Council, they are dealing with Sri Lanka. During the past 15 years, there have been 9 Human Rights Council drafts or proposed or passed resolutions on Sri Lanka, all under the compromising agenda item 2. But the root crime, genocide, still not addressed. Look at one of these resolutions from 2014 March 25/1, which talks about the 13th Amendment. Encourages the government of Sri Lanka to ensure that all provincial councils, including the Northern Provincial Council, are able to operate effectively in accordance with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of Sri Lanka. Again, we go to the peace process. A quick look at how funds were used by the Norwegian government during the peace process, and who were the Sri Lankan agenda setting agents who were receiving the funds. Milinda Moragoda, a US friendly and now Rajapaksa friendly minister who was very active in the peace process, along with GL Piris, Professor Piris. Now he is the foreign minister handling the USA, UN Human Rights Council, and India. In India, you find Milinda Moragoda nowadays as the cabinet rank high commissioner who has promised to make wonders for Gotabaya Rajapaksa. So what WikiLeaks reveals about his role in peace process. The WikiLeaks cable from May 2003, look at how it describes GL Piris and Milinda. Let me see. Oh. More than Piris, Moragoda's direct focus has been on cultivating relations with the US and with India. Born in Washington, DC, married to an American and a big picture person. WikiLeaks cable. So you see how the geopolitical dealings are going behind. So now let us look at the Tamil dilemmas. The dilemma of the Tamils has always been making choices between what is pragmatic, as described from an Orientalist, outside or theoretical perspective, as I said earlier, and what is regarded as the absolute minimum, irreversible guarantee to secure their collective rights in order to protect their existence as a people, nation. That's the situation. Geopolitics, induced realpolitik versus principles-oriented Tamil cause, Tamil struggle. And then you have surrender diplomacy or surrender collaborationist politics. One has to learn this from Trichelvam up to Sumandran. They belong to the same school. Before war, Trichelvam was working with the government. Now his continuing student, Sumandran, is working with the Tamil National Alliance. So this type of surrender collaborationist politics versus Navaratnam and Prabhakaran school of thought the other dilemma. And then you have, as I already pointed out, the accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity discourse in the UN, Human Rights Council, against the focus and action on international justice against protracted genocide. Protracted genocide means past, current, and future, preventing role. There are a lot of other challenges as well. Particularly, maintaining the status quo, compatibility of certain historiographic justification factors of the Tamil struggle. For example, all the post-independence Ceylon and subsequent Sri Lankan constitutions were enacted without the democratic mandate of the Tamils. At the same time, Tamils also take part in the Sri Lankan parliament, which restricts their right of self-determination through Sixth Amendment. The elected Tamil parliamentarians cannot be the sole representative for the Tamils, especially on the subject of representing the democratically mandated aspiration and engage in talks with parity of status at the negotiation table. So Sri Lankan parliamentarians cannot be the peace-making agents or negotiating partners with the Sri Lankan state, according to the Tamil, because it's a denial of the Tamil. They have no right to represent the Tamil aspiration because of the Sixth Amendment. So if you have to have a genuine peace process, they need to point out someone else to take up the negotiation. So this is a short, quick trip, and then Canadian responsibility, which is interesting. Let us see. Solution. The role of Canadian Elam Tamil diaspora, the responsibility of the Canadian state and the larger civil society was what we were talking about. So we need to look more broadly and see the context of Canada in a wider perspective, considering all aspects, dilemmas, and challenges. Canada is a diasporic home to largest number of exiled Tamils who fled actually the genocidal onslaught in their traditional homeland. The Tamil people in Canada look up to their country as their second homeland, where they have integrated with dignity and equality, as I told you earlier. So we need to urge the government of Canada to be mindful of the injustices committed by the colonial, post-colonial powers and not the geopolitical injustice committed. And the Canadian Tamils of Elam Tamil origins need to perceive their government's role in voicing international investigations on Tamil genocide as a mutual and duty-bound obligation, symbolizing their integration in Canada. So let us look into a bit more details here. Don't do ICC cases that don't lead us towards genocide investigation. This is my first advice. Don't waste your efforts on ICC cases that don't deal with genocide directly, because you are undermining the genocide argument. Challenge the initial ban on the Ltte with the tribunal while demanding not to continue the ban. We can also involve the civil society in Canada to this. The tribunal would be looking at why Canada banned the Ltte, how it was done, how McKinsey Institute was used by the Sri Lankan government, how media was handled. A long time ago, they started with the process. Even Sivaram was not able to travel to Canada. He told me several times. He was able to travel to US. In US, you have all freedom. But in Canada, he couldn't do it. So there's a lot that needs to be found out. Then question the R2P failure, because the R2P was a concept that was brought into UN by the initiative of Canada in 2001, I think. So in 2009, R2P was not applied at all when Canadian leadership was there. Then we need to also engage with Louis Arbour, who was the UN Human Rights High Commissioner from 2006 onwards, who knew how Sri Lankan government was faking the UN human rights discourse already before the war. And then she also went on to ICG, where she refused outrightly the Tamil right to self-determination. And she also said that Tamil didn't earn the right to fight for sovereign solution.
Excuse me, Mr.
Is the time gone?
Yeah, the time is running up, but if you wanted to quickly summarize.
Yeah, I can go on. And then demand, genocide investigation demand has been passed in Parliament. That's a good news. I think it was done in 2019. So all set, in fact, that Canada can demand the ICJ process for a genocide case. I think Sri Lankan government is helping us on this front by initiating a case against the genocide education bill. Then you have a state dispute. You need a state dispute to file a case at the ICJ. So we need to confront the case successfully and make this state dispute into ICJ process. And then last priority for universal jurisdiction cases, civil society can be involved here. And the recognition of right of self-determination of Ulam Tamils is also a special point. I can turn to the next slide for that one and then conclude. We talk about exceptional circumstances for the recognition of self-determination. There are 4 situations: colonial situations, de facto situations, human rights involved situations such as genocide, and then you have situations involving more than one state. In our context, all 4 could be applied because it's a historically long process where you have had more than one state involved as well. But in looking at Canada, Canada has an erga omnes obligation to take up the ICJ case on genocide. The rights and obligations enshrined by the Genocide Convention, including the duty to prevent genocide under Article 1, are rights and obligations erga omnes, meaning this is an ICJ opinion. The duty to prevent genocide was an obligation owed not only to the other states parties to the Genocide Convention, but also to the international community as a whole, thus expanding it beyond its treaty constraints. And then right of self-determination is also becoming increasingly treated as a jus cogens norm, also leading to state action in future. So we should have a resolution in Canadian Parliament recognizing Tamil's right to self-determination as well. So that is, I can go on and say, just as concluding, many traps. We have had many traps. I have lots of slides more, but I don't have enough time, so I will not be going through them. The secular identity trap, it's a positive one, but it was affecting us negatively. Then you have the language-based identity trap, because we are not the land-based identity, we have mostly language-based identity. And then we have this inclusivist approach always, which is a positive one, but it's a trap in the Sri Lankan context. And then you have this invader trap. We are being called invader. It's a negative one. Then we don't have a state of our own, a no state trap. Then you have the regional Aryan Dravidian trap, which has also been working negatively on our context. And then you have this peace trap, as I explained, and there are a lot more other traps which we will go through in future workshops. If there are questions, I don't know whether we have time to it or whether we'll take it later on.
So the questions, we will leave it to the end.
Okay.
We are, Professor Joseph Chandra is patiently waiting for his next speech. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. So next, I would like to introduce Professor Joseph Chandra. He is a professor at the University of Toronto and a co-author of Tamil's Identity and Aspirations. On completing his doctoral studies in Canada, he returned to the University of Jaffna and was founding head of the Department of Christian and Islamic Studies. He held a seasonal professorship in biblical studies at Concordia University in Montreal from 1996 to 1999. And in 2000, he joined the faculty of the University of Toronto Joint Center for Bioethics. His topic today would be the consequences of listing, ethnic stigmatization, and an unjust psychosocial regression. Please join me in welcoming Professor Joseph Chandra.
Thank you, Siva. I hope you cannot hear me. Against the background of what has already been said, and we have had three very invaluable presentations. Our Prime Minister, Rudra Kumar Viswanathan, pointed out the aspects of terrorist designation and how that is continued by various nuances of political discourse and actions. Then we had also a presentation by Abhina on different levels at which the youth in Canada particularly see the listing of Ltte as a terrorist organization and the impacts it's having on their education, on their future pursuits. Mr. J. Chandra and Gobinath gave us a very comprehensive view of, a very valuable view, in fact, of the different approaches to peace, which had been laid before us as forms of traps into which various groups and entities have fallen into. And the need to be, therefore, be cautious as we engage in similar forms of discourse in the future. If in the context of what had already been said or enunciated by these three great speakers, my little task would be to give you very briefly some of the serious consequences of listing of Ltte as a terrorist organization in various countries, largely by the European Union and also by the United States, and particularly in Canada. If I wish to draw your attention to some of these consequences which personally affect us and also which affect us collectively as the community in Canada. Speaking of the different efforts made in terms of, particularly by the Norwegian government, in retrospect, we lament the unfortunate turn of events that the listing was in fact enacted and enforced midway through the peace negotiations and without any humanitarian concern, with total insensitivity to the protection of Tamil civilians in the war zone, as well as a denial of protection to the members of the Sri Lanka monitoring mission, as they brought in the listing. 3 out of the 5 were drawn from countries that are members of the European Union itself. And that's why the Ltte later on issued a deadline for the removal of monitors from those 3 countries, namely Denmark, Finland, and Sweden. Later on, report was done, a study report with, I would say there have been a number of lacunas or vacuums in the report. Bonds of peace, evaluation of Norwegian peace efforts in Sri Lanka from 1997 to 2009. The report was produced in 2011, and it laments the fact that the EU listing of the Ltte had very important implications for the Sri Lanka monitoring mission. And it also says that the head of mission at that time, the Swedish retired Major General Ulf Henriksson, had personally intervened and sent a memo arguing against the ban, saying that there are immediate negative consequences for the Sri Lanka monitoring mission and it could aggravate the escalating dynamics of violence. Certainly, Norway did not intervene in the EU decision as Norway is not a member, but also it made it clear that, the ban will have negative consequences mainly for the monitoring mission, leaving aside the consequences that it will have for the people. And we all know that Canada brought in the ban on 10th of April 2006, and the Council of the European Union followed suit from 30th May 2006. Among them, Norway is the only country that was among the four co-chairs. The co-chairs, as you know, were Norway, European Union, US, and Japan. That was the only country that did not enforce the ban or enact the ban. More importantly, as the report itself observes, that Indian objections and opposition to the Ltte began to translate into very firmer backing to the government of Sri Lanka. And this is codified in the Norwegian report. And Sri Lankan government statements were subsequently given credibility and taken to their face value by the Indian government, and they were popularizing them or adapting them afterwards, and therefore Sri Lankan government got it was done in order to ensure international credibility in the print media and in the electronic media. And the Sri Lanka monitoring mission also has said that India was heavily leaning on the side of the government of Sri Lanka, providing them with military hardware while the talks are going on, saying that they are for defensive purposes, and we know weapons are weapons, that they are for defensive or offensive purposes, but it was a kind of diplomatic camouflage to say that they were supplying only defensive weapons. At the same time, they also went around with At the same time, they also went around with very strong and diplomatic offensive. And we know that the Defense Secretary of the time, Mr. M.K. Narayanan, who is known for his anti-Tamil bickerings, he personally visited a number of countries, canvassing in favor of Sri Lanka and therefore against the Ltte. And he had certain personal interest in that, which we know subsequently from various other writings and observations made by people. Now, in my presentation, I'll focus on two issues, namely, I call it psychosocial aggression, and also there is a serious form of stigmatization, which has come upon the Tamils as a result of delisting. Aggression is often used as a political concept. It is an unjustified plan, threatened, or other forms of action carried out by the use of force by one nation against another. And therefore, I use it advisably to say that we Tamils suffer this as a nation. And we should never forget the fact that Tamils are not a minority, but they are a nationality. Tamils, particularly the Tamils of Tamil. And therefore, we need to start defining aggression And our definition should fit in with the general definition of an aggression that is unjust and an aggression that is devastating to a community and a nation. And that kind of aggressions include instrumental, hostile, relational, and also cyberbullying. By dictionary definition of aggression will come into that. Therefore, we need to tackle these specific forms of aggression, such as crime, workplace violence, bullying, violence in terms of verbal assault, and other forms of harassment. So this begins by a form of ethnic stigmatization that we suffer as a result of being Tamils. And we know in Sri Lanka, a person should to be killed just because he or she is a Tamil. Our identity was enough to warrant death, disappearance, mutilation, murder, arbitrary arrest, and so on. Stigmatization continues because in their anxiety to gain quickly popularity and perhaps even substantial financial gain and other fringe benefits, there are researchers engaging in what they call terrorism research. And now that has been turned into diaspora research. And they tend to make labels or apply labels to the Tamil community, such as diaspora Tamil militancy, diaspora Tamil extremism, diaspora radicalization of Tamils, diaspora's long-distance nationalism. And some of the Tamils are doing it because perhaps it becomes, for them, it is lucrative to do it. And they have published academic journals with very dubious reputations and largely with propaganda motives, and also to supply material to the different intelligence agencies in Canada and outside. Even though serious-minded scholars designate such writers and such essays as kind of paparazzi exercises, or some scholars even call them paparazzi academics. And well known among these, there is a gentleman named Peter Schalk, not Peter Schalk. As you know, Professor Peter Schalk is a Swedish professor. There's another person with the name Peter Schalk, C-H-A-L-K. There's Michael Roberts, Amarnath Amarasinghe, Camelia Nathaniel, Chandra Dharmavatna, and many others. Very recently, Chandra Dharmavatna, who is the professor at the Université de Montréal or University of Montreal, and who has recently published an article entitled How Canadian Legislators Reacted to Two Genocides Claims, and Canada's claimed support for conflict prevention in Sri Lanka. This person is teaching there at the Université de Montréal and also funded by the National Research Council of Canada at our taxpayers' money. I quote, he says, meanwhile, back in Canada, successive Canadian governments have failed to understand how this very hate speech, and what he calls hate speech is in fact the declaration of Genocide Studies Week. He names it as hate speech. Is being entrenched in Canadian municipal discourse and even in parliamentary proceedings by militant diaspora groups. And referring to the Tamils in Ontario, the same author laments, I quote, unfortunately, militant elements in diaspora groups who wish to replay the old ethnic animosities of their homelands in Canada, unquote. On the other hand, we also have forms of cyber terrorism directly or directed against the Tamils, particularly Tamil researchers, Tamil scholars, Tamil academics, youth leaders, charitable groups, religious leaders. And most of these are owned and operated by a band of singular groups or their associates, and allegedly supported and financed by the government of Sri Lanka. And these persons and these websites are in fact causing enormous psychological and social trauma to many Tamil individuals and community organizations, and also to students who try to engage in research that would bring out the truth in deeper forms to sensitize and to bring it in the open to government agencies and others. But once they are labeled and marked and stigmatized, the hard work that they put in becomes futile. And all this is done in the name of attaching the Ltte label to anyone and everyone who speaks for human rights, for social justice, for restitutional justice, or engage in humanitarian work in favor of war widows, amputees, and orphan children, or establish institutions and charitable organizations to support them. All these are very quickly labeled as Ltte front organizations, and this goes on at a time when Ltte, as we all know, does not exist as an institution. The listing of European Union and Canada also has given the government of Sri Lanka an open warrant, a kind of a carte blanche to arrest, detain, or even to murder and to maim any Tamil person, stating that Canada has declared Ltte as a terrorist organization, EU has declared, and this, as we all know, has been corrected repeatedly. So the government of Sri Lanka that has not only refrained from protecting its own Tamil citizens during the pogroms of 1956, 1958, 1960, 1972, 1977, 1983, and so on, where the government's armed forces not only refrained from protecting the people, but actively took part in murders, in mutilations of Tamils, and also in aiding and abetting in the torching and looting of their properties. The listing of EU and Canada also gave Sri Lanka the power to deny to the Tamils the fundamental freedoms of expression, freedom of association. And it gave them also a false legitimacy for surveillance and to violate Tamil persons' right to privacy, both economic and social, and I would say even cultural. All this, as you would see, when it is being parroted out, often the citation underneath is Canada, EU, US, and several other countries have designated Tamil terrorism. And Tamil terrorism and Ltte terrorism is sometimes used interchangeably in these writings. And these are cited, these are quoted to support positions taken by the different intelligence agencies and security agencies in Canada and outside. On the other hand, it also gives a false sense of legitimacy to all racially motivated extremists from the non-Tamil quarters and even from some Tamil quarters to write, to publish, to intimidate, and to label and stigmatize everyone. Another topic I would like to develop on is also the denial of memorialization. We know as an ancient community, remembering the dead is inseparably bound with our cultural and traditional practices, beginning with our families and also extending to the larger community. Memorializing is marked by activities and actions done to mourn and remember people, places, or even things that are of significance to individuals, families, and communities. Seen from a psychological angle, memorials have been celebrated, established. Sometimes memorial buildings or structures are erected in relation to people's memories and as mechanisms for coping with deep sense of grief, loss, and trauma. For example, memorialization has also been used by people to cope with the feelings of guilt, of forgetfulness, of the responsibility that is sometimes associated with the member who is a surviving member of a family. As we know, in some families, there are 6 members, 5 were killed and only 1 is left. But even that one is not permitted in Sri Lanka to remember the other 5 who were dead. There has been a number of literature being published today by different writers, not only looking at memorialization of victims of terrorism, as sometimes the titles would say, but also memorialization in terms of victims of state terrorism. the externalization of events, of persons, and to bring them out in order to remember them. Listing in various ways prevents us from this most foundational human exercise and experience. Externalization, as we also know, is necessary, and I quote from Olainer in his article on the externalization of function of memorials. And he says externalization is a necessary process that uses memorials to facilitate the use of objects in external reality to overcome internal conflicts that plague people's conscious after traumatic events. From the sociological perspective, research on memorials is varied and covers a wide range of topics such as the meanings attached to memorials and the basic functions of memorials. There is another author, Zitun, who has written about memorials and semiotic dynamics on the journal Culture and Psychology. And he speaks about various angles from which these memorials could be seen, memorialization can be seen. First, they are used to reinforce notions of trust in the nation state, the ethnic identity and loss of that identity due to premeditated and vicious forms of annihilation of their communal identity by the power of the monoethnic state. And we all know how the government of Sri Lanka sought to not only to exterminate the very existence of our identity, but all identities of our existence are also destroyed. Therefore, memorials help us to re-establish that identity with courage and firmness. And it helps us also to interact collectively with other people. Thirdly, they function as sites of mourning. And lastly, they provide opportunities of learning. In general, it's important to note that although the scope of research on memorials and memorializing is wide and diverse, this area has only been recently initiated, and we as a community constantly should remember, because forgetfulness is an antidote against our existence. As I have always said, stated and written, we Tamils need to continue with our memory, and we need to live with our memory. Listing erases that memory. Listing emphasizes forgetfulness and not allowing us to perpetuate the memory. These are the two major points that I wanted to focus on, and I hope as the time is running out, and I hope as we open it for discussion, I will be able to stay more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Next in our segment, I'll be introducing Dr. Toro Redcrow, who is an American global conflict analyst who specializes in geopolitics, stateless nations, and armed guerrilla movements. He's a frequent speaker before the United Nations Human Rights Council and has been a foreign policy advisor for several semi-state entities. He holds a PhD in conflict analysis and resolution with specializations in ethnic conflict and terrorism. He will be speaking to the title, Roaring Against Annihilation, How Sri Lankan State Terrorism Created Tamil Tiger Salvational Violence. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Toro Redcrow.
Hello, everyone. I want to say first, it's an honor to partake in this conference, and hopefully as a non-Tamil individual, you will recognize that my words are an accurate echo of your struggle and confirm the reality that many of you have lived and witnessed throughout your life. As he spoke about, a lot of my research looks at the fact that guerrilla insurgencies, they can only arise and sustain themselves if you have an occupying government that is committing systematic state terrorism and leaving no peaceful avenues available for a dispossessed population to redress their subjugation. And essentially, when you look at the history in Sri Lanka and Tamil Eelam, what you see is that the Sri Lankan state created the historical conditions for the rise of the Ltte, and that the Sri Lankan military fueled the perceived necessity of someone like Prabhakaran and his armed struggle amongst the population of Tamil Eelam through their widespread oppression and attempts at cultural extermination. That without the former, you wouldn't have had the latter. And that, unfortunately, in most Western discourse, we see an incorrect characterization of most of these armed struggles. And that rather than viewing them as irrational fanaticism, these kind of rebellions, they should be viewed as a logical reaction by desperate people who come to believe that their potential death in combat is preferable to the daily humiliation and deprivation that they suffer. So essentially, to put it in more simple terms, a group like the Ltte could not survive and maintain support amongst the Tamil population if you didn't have a long history of oppression and daily acts of violence against the Tamil population and daily humiliations committed against them that would convince a younger Tamil person that they are better off taking up an AK-47 and fighting in a military conflict where their death is likely and where the odds are severely against them. People don't reach that conclusion unless there really is no other alternative. And that if all peaceful avenues have been cut off, the population looks at military means as being their only possible solution. To begin, as someone who specializes in terrorism and armed guerrillas and different movements throughout the world, I want to first recognize that probably the most abused word in the entire English language is the word terrorism, right? The word terrorism, it almost is so devoid of meaning at this point that I wish we could actually get rid of the word, because it doesn't, any value that it might have, it is much more dangerous in the way that it's used. However, if you were going to use the word terrorism in any capacity, I would say that state terrorism is actually much more accurate than looking at sort of guerrilla terrorism or insurgency terrorism, because of the fact that the deaths committed by states through state terrorism is usually 90 to 95% of all the deaths in any conflict. So if we're going to use the word terrorism, which I guess comes from terror or terrorizing, it is the occupying state that terrorizes and sows terror, far more than any kind of resistance or insurgency might, fighting against them. Of course, you have the classic adage that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. But I think you can also say that in the modern age, the way we look at it is a terrorist essentially is somebody who has a bomb but doesn't have an air force to drop it from, or somebody who doesn't have the advanced military means to defend themselves. What you see is the states around the world get together and they declare that they're the only ones who can basically use military means to address their concerns, and any non-state entity that defends themselves in any way is unfortunately labeled a terrorist. If you look throughout history, you see it from Nelson Mandela and the ANC throughout the 70s and 80s, and you see it in almost every anti-colonial struggle throughout the 1960s and 70s. They were all labeled terrorist organizations, and essentially you're only a terrorist group until your party is victorious and wins, and then gets to rewrite the history and make yourself non-terrorist. It's also more outrageous when you consider that Western states, the United States, the European Union, have listed the Ltte as a terrorist organization when the Ltte has never killed a single American citizen in their entire history. So when you consider the absurdity that a nation would label a group a terrorist organization that has never attacked them in their entire history, you realize that it's more a political label that has little value. As somebody who's studied occupations throughout the world, not just in Tamil Eelam, I noticed that there is a symbiotic relationship between occupation and undevelopment, and that you basically have a history of oppression, an architecture of cruelty, and an ecosystem of hopelessness. And then if you don't have these things, you won't get an armed insurgency against it. And if you look at the situation in occupied Tamil Eelam, there were a series of laws and behaviors that created the conditions that allowed for the Ltte. Basically, going back all the way to 1948, the Independent Citizenship Act, where you have 700,000 Indian Tamils, they're made stateless, 300,000 deported. The 1956 Sinhala Act, where Sinhala becomes the official language and Tamil workers in the government are forced to resign. The 1958 anti-Tamil programs, where you have 1,500 Tamils murdered. And then they banned the Tamil language from being imported from Tamil Nadu. 1964, when the government expels 600,000 Indian Tamils again. 1970, when they ban the import of Tamil films, books, magazines, journals. 1977, when you have the Sinhalese mobs, which murder another 300 Tamils. 1978, the Constitution, which gives a preference to Buddhism and the Sinhala over Hindu Tamils. The 1981, and this is, I think, the most significant event in Tamil Eelam history, when you have the burning of the Jaffna Library by the ruling politicians, destroying the 93,000 books and priceless palm leaf scrolls. This sort of literary genocide that takes place there in Tamil Eelam. Without these events, you wouldn't have the support base to create the LTT and to be able to draw fighters from the population. And I would note that the ambushes and the attacks by the LTTE that occur in 1983 all occur after all of the events that I've mentioned. It isn't until you have programs in Colombo, you have 3,000 Tamils killed by mobs, you have 5,000 shops burned, 8,000 homes, 150,000 homeless, Black July massacre. These kind of events are needed to sow the seeds that become the LTTE resistance led by Prabhakaran. When you look at the overall numbers, obviously, you see that from 1983 to 2004, the Sri Lankan government is estimated to have killed around 47 to 50,000 Tamil civilians. And even in the last months of 2009, perhaps another 70,000 Tamil civilians. So if you add these two figures together, you get roughly 120,000 to 150,000 Tamils murdered by the Sri Lankan state. That to me is the state terrorism. If you counter that with what they call the LTTE quote unquote terrorism, it's estimated that you have about 4,000 people killed in 200 separate attacks throughout the history. So when you're looking at a death total of 150,000 on the state side, on the Sri Lankan state side, and 4,000 on the LTTE side, you realize that this is not an accurate way to view the conflict. And the fact that one of them gets called terrorism and the other one gets no label at all and able to represent themselves internationally truly is an outrage. A lot of my research looks at the historical conditions as well that create armed guerrilla movements. And normally you have to have a series of things take place. You need to have material conditions take place where basically an occupying state seizes territory, steals resources, destroys nature, pollutes rivers, uproots the trees, dig up artifacts, looting of stores, ethnic cleansing, assassinations, kidnappings for ransom, forced taxes, mass arrests, burning of villages, death squads. The Sri Lankan state basically carried out all of these behaviors in Tamil Eelam. Then you also have the psychological issues that the Sri Lankan state does, whether you rename the streets, they build statues of the occupation leaders, they destroy indigenous monuments, as our previous speaker spoke about. The forced language instruction. They create a false history and a false narrative that Buddhists have always been there, that Tamils arrived later, that the original history of Tamil Eelam really belongs to the Sinhala. They create this sort of false history. You prevent the return of inhabitants. You desecrate shrines and holy places. The rape of women and girls. You set up checkpoints to degrade the personal dignity of people. You chop up the territory with different walls. And then you create forced disappearances, which this creates a fear amongst the population. It's much more effective to disappear people than it is to murder them. Because if you murder them, the family has a grave to mourn at, and they are, and they have a final sort of, there's some finality to the act. But when you disappear them and you make thousands disappear, what happens is those mothers wonder if their son will ever come back home again. They sort of behave and don't cause problems to the state because they wonder, well, if my son is still in prison, maybe they'll kill him. If he's still alive, I don't want to cause any problems against the state at this time. So the Sri Lankan state, oftentimes, it's much more effective to kidnap the population of Tamils than to actually murder them. And you see this with the large amount of mass graves, especially produced in 2009, with the shelling of the beaches and killing of civilians. I think it's important to recognize that the LTTE struggle is justified throughout international law. There's lots of different international resolutions, everything from General Resolution 1514 in 1960 that says all peoples have the right to self-determination by virtue of that right to freely determine their political status. You have General Assembly Resolution 2625 in 1970. It says people seeking their own self-determination are entitled to seek and receive support. So this would also entitle the LTTE to receive outside support from outside states. You have General Assembly Resolution 2908 in 1972 that reaffirms the recognition of the legitimacy of the struggle of colonial peoples and the right to self-determination and independence. And most importantly, it says by all the necessary means at their disposal. It doesn't put any limits on what kind of means they can use. So that right there enshrines that any armed force that is necessary to preserve your existence is legal. You also have Protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention, paragraph 4, Article 1 from 1977 that grants that people can exercise self-determination against colonial domination, alien occupation, and racist regimes, which the Sri Lankan government would clearly be defined as a racist regime and an alien occupier. Reason why I bring up these laws is to show that there already is the legal justification for the LTTE struggle. And the fact that states have criminalized it and in a sense criminalized what to even exist as a Tamil in Tamil Islam becomes all the more outrageous. For those who are saying, well, you need to have reconciliation at this point, I would argue that you know, any kind of denial of these facts will only bring about a future armed resistance, and that you can't have reconciliation without an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The problem is the Sri Lankan state at this point doesn't even acknowledge the war crimes that they committed. You still have the statues of the war criminals standing in many of the Tamil cities, and this sort of indignity of making a Tamil population look at monuments made to their own occupier and the people that murdered their children or raped their sisters or destroyed their homes is a true injustice. And what I have found through studying the history is that what this will do is it will cause the rise of a new LTTE in the future. If the Sri Lankan state doesn't change the conditions, all you're going to have is a repeat of a LTTE 2.0, let's say, where if the conditions are the same, the resistance will rise up again in the exact same way that it did. Now, it may come first maybe from Tamil Nadu and then travel into Tamil Islam, but the conditions are still there for people to take up arms in that way. You see internationally, especially in the United Nations Human Rights Council, the 30/1 is obviously a sham because it allows the Sri Lankan state to judge themselves. And any common sense will tell you that a war criminal will obviously find themselves innocent if they're judging their own war crimes. A better option might be the International Criminal Court, but again, as a previous speaker spoke about, there's also some risks to that as well. I think you would need to have some kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but I'm not that big on the idea of reconciliation, more a truth commission, where the Sri Lankan state admits first to the war crimes that they've committed, and then you have to have someone answer for, things like the White Flag Massacre and these kind of situations. Connected to that, in my research, I talk about the idea of salvational violence because I try to separate. There's sort of regular violence, which I would call like senseless violence, when you attack a target for no other reason, maybe than rage or anger. But I would say when you have a legitimate guerrilla insurgency, these guerrilla movements don't want to alienate the population. So, for instance, you mainly attack government forces or the military, and this violence is seen as defensive, not offensive. And my research with armed guerrillas from other nations and movements have shown me that usually the people that join an armed guerrilla movement, these would be the best people in society if the oppression didn't exist. So these would be your doctors and your professors and your artists and your musicians. These are oftentimes the best that a society has to offer, the people that become the armed guerrillas. But the problem is that when you have these situations of oppression, oftentimes the people that join guerrilla movements, they suffer state abuse at a very young age. I think if you looked at interviews with LTTE fighters, you would see that almost all of them are probably suffer some kind of police abuse by the Sri Lankan police or by a Sri Lankan teacher, or that they see their parents humiliated as young children. There's this sort of humiliation that takes place at a very young age, and this sets the seed for them as they grow up and get older, why they take up arms and why they become part of the armed resistance at that time. And it's not without these indignities that they wouldn't do that. There's a reason why throughout all the world and throughout the LTTE, many of the fighters are college graduates. They have other skills. There's many other things they could do, as I said, but it's the conditions that leave them no other choice. And so rather than focusing on sort of the actions of guerrilla movements and things that we think they could do better or do wrong, what we need to look at is the way that states create them. They are essentially a Frankensteinian creation of the state itself. It's as easy as if you were making bread and you add the ingredients to the bread, the water, the yeast, the grain, and then you get bread. If a state does oppression, bans the language, doesn't give a group their rights, murders them, disappears them, commits acts against their mothers and their sisters, has no accountability for them. Every time they create a political party, they ban it or they call it a terrorist party. If you have these conditions, what you get is you get an armed guerrilla movement like the Tamil Tigers. And so the West especially, and I say this as an American, needs to look in the mirror and see how shamelessly they have been when they've labeled these groups as terrorist organizations. And they need to understand it is the state terrorism and the state terror that has created these conditions. Personally, in my own time, I've been lucky enough to do some work with the Tamil movement and in Geneva with the Human Rights Council and bring up some of these issues. But the problem is that there's not many speakers outside of the Tamil community that are willing to take on this struggle and speak about it. And so what happens is you have Tamils basically speaking amongst other Tamils, and all of you understand this reality, but it's very rare that outside groups give it any publicity or talk about it. And some of this is because of language, and some of this is because the Tamil diaspora is spread out over Canada, the UK, and throughout all of these countries. So it would be my hope, as somebody who believes in the legitimacy of the Tamil struggle, that all of the diaspora groups can come together and sort of unify the message and put some of the sectarian differences aside and realize that the only way to salvation for Tamil Eelam and for the Tamil population is to focus on the very important things, and that's the fact that Tamil Eelam deserves independence as every other people in the world do, and that that it's unfair in a world where Scotland can have a referendum for their own independence, but Tamil Eelam is denied that right. It's unfair that it seems that we have a global system that says certain people in the world get the right to be free and deserve their own rights, but the Tamil people do not. Now, some of this is based on race, some of this is based on class, some of this is based on colonialism, but all of it is unfair in any capacity where it exists. I can guarantee you 100% that if Tamil Eelam was in Southern Europe or Central Europe, this wouldn't even be a debate. They would be viewed as freedom fighters and resistors, and the global community would be in their favor, and Hollywood actors would be holding up the Tamil Tiger flag, and you would have this sort of movement for them. But because of the geographical location and some of the history and some of the unfair ways that our globe kind of has an international order, the Tamil cause is ignored. So I think, in closing, I would say that I hope that as a non-Tamil individual that I can at least be one example to show that there are non-Tamils who understand this reality, and that the more you can get your message out there and get it seen, the better, because the arc of the universe, it bends towards justice, but it takes a very long time to get there. And I hope that at some point in the future there will be an independent and free Tamil Eelam, and then the Tamils can write their own history and show that all of this time their resistance was justified. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Redcrow, for your speech. Moving on to the next segment, I will be introducing Mr. Rajiv Sridharan. He is an author, an engineer, and corporate attorney. Rajiv is also the co-founder of NEEDY and provides pro bono counsel in the practice areas of genocide, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law to selected NGOs and grassroots organizations. His topic will be Wartime Delisting 101. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Rajiv Sridharan.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Thanks everyone. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this conference. So I'm going to give my legal perspective from a 30,000-foot view on how delisting after 9/11 during wartime works, and some of the challenges and how it relates to May 2009, Justice for May 2009, and generally to the human rights and civil liberties of the Tamil diaspora in general. And so I'll do this by talking through 3 slides, and I'll try to keep my comments as brief as possible and can answer questions later. Siva, I think you have to let me share my screen.
Share screen, please. Let me get the organizers to do that for you.
Okay.
Username is Rajiv.
If it works out. Yeah. Okay. So I think.
Yeah, we're able to see your screen now.
Okay. Okay. Great. So, and for some background, I've been involved in the European Union delisting proceeding that was done a while back, and have been advising various Canadian groups regarding the delisting process in Canada. And so I'm just going to talk about, without much legalese, just talk about what it looks like, sort of demystify it, and try to connect it to the other issues. So in that first section A, so this is just the nuts and bolts process to initiate a delisting proceeding. Pretty much, there's a filing procedure. It's reviewed. You get an outcome. The entity remains on the list or it's delisted. If the entity remains on the list, there's an appeal process. And then that leads to some sort of appeal in court, which then gets you to a final outcome. In terms of the EU, UK, and Canada, generally how the West has designed foreign terrorist organizations, these FTO listing proceedings, is there's a political decision to list, then there's a period of review, so they look at it every 2 to 3 years, 4 years. Some of the barriers, just one point on this before I move to the next item below, some of the barriers, one, you have a cost barrier. Can the impacted communities afford to hire legal representation to engage in the delisting process? That's one. 2, and this is the primary barrier that I see. Most of the legislation requires the entity itself to initiate the proceeding. So then this can raise criminal risk, and there's a whole host of issues that can surface by just the standing requirement. If we move down to the section B, basically the listing proceeding is part of a nation state's domestic law, and the way it works is the domestic law is applied extraterritorially to the foreign conflict zone. So, for example, when Canada and the EU listed the LTTE in 2006. It's basically Canadian EU sort of domestic legislation applying to the LTTE overseas in Sri Lanka. And this often must go through the international treaty obligations that the nation states have. In my experience, since there was this thrust to list a lot of organizations after 9/11, not much compliance or review was done of whether or not the terrorism listing complied with international law obligations. And just to give you a list of 5 non-Sri Lanka related listing or delisting decisions. In 2012, the MEK, that's an Iranian political military group, was delisted in US and Canada. In 2020, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, ETIM, that's basically a Uyghur rebel movement in China, that was delisted by the US. In 2021, Ansar Allah, a Houthi rebel movement in Yemen, this was delisted by the US. And then for everyone who's been following some of the global news, there's a civil war movement going on in Ethiopia in the Tigray region. Some of the uses of force by that group could have been listed under terrorism regimes, but was not. So, right, so the Tigray rebels are not a terrorist organization. And in Myanmar, you have multiple armed groups that again are using force and would be eligible for FTO designations, but the West has decided to not apply their domestic laws extraterritorially. And so I'll return to this relationship between domestic law and international law in the next screen. The third bucket, the way I've been analyzing delisting logic is how the actual entity listing is defended is through a list of attacks by the listed group. And if you look at the Sri Lanka case, basically you have a party to an armed conflict listed as a terrorist organization. And if you look at every use of force by Sri Lanka and every use of force by the Ltte, it sort of looks like a time series data set where through the different wars, both parties are using force. And what we see in the FTO designations is they're supported by just cherry picking the uses of force by one party. So in that section C, pretty much the red dots would be LTT uses of force. And if there's an LTT use of force, there's typically a government use of force, before and after, because if you look at the totality of the circumstances, there was an armed conflict. But the black dots are generally excluded from the statement of attacks that are asserted to defend an FDL state. So that's the third point. The fourth point about constitutional order. So this also comes up in trying to mount a delisting proceeding. In most constitutional liberal democracies, you have separation of powers. So you have different branches: executive, legislative, and the judiciary. Now, typically the listing decision is delegated to, basically what's called the administrative state. And that sort of the bureaucratic labyrinth around engaging the administrative state makes it much harder to get transparency on, why the listing is in place, what the evidence is. Often, I think in the UK, we saw there's a lot of secret evidence, secret laws, and also the standard of review for the evidence to uphold or defend the listing is lower than you would have for a sort of traditional crime. So these are the four main points. I'm now going to shift to the second slide. Okay, we are on slide number 2. Hopefully everyone can see this. So I drew this slide just to give everyone a sort of, a bigger context within which the Canadian and EU delistings happen. And I really wanted to highlight 3 points. One is about the conflict classification, which you see in humanitarian law literature. So I'll explain that. The second one is the relationship between a domestic terrorism prescription and an ongoing international peace process. So conflict classification is issue 1. Issue number 2 is the relationship between the bans and the peace process. And issue 3 is just to highlight, what this democracy versus terrorism paradigm looked like in Sri Lanka during May 2009. So just to back up, if we go back to February 2002, you pretty much have a peace process degenerating into a war, which then escalated into May 2009, and then May 2009, the armed conflict ended. So the first issue in terms of conflict classification, basically there's 2 types of armed conflicts. One is called non-international armed conflict, the acronym is NIAC, and the other is international armed conflict. And what we see is pretty much in a non-international armed conflict, the uses of force by the non-state actor can be subject to criminal laws, whether or not they comply with the laws of war. So just to state that again, when we look at a non-international armed conflict, because that's how, let's say, a conflict is classified like that. The Sri Lankan war is currently classified as a non-international armed conflict. Under this model, if the LTT uses force and it complies with the Geneva Convention, that use of force can still be classified as an act of terrorism. Now, if the conflict is an international armed conflict, so it's reclassified, and this debate has never really, at least to my knowledge, it has never really been explored in general Tamil debates. But if the conflict is reclassified as an international armed conflict, the parties, including the LTT, would have combatant immunity from domestic criminal prosecution. And that means if the conflict is an international armed conflict, if the LTT uses force and it complies with the laws of war, it cannot be also proscribed as an act of terrorism, right? So this conflict classification issue comes up, as you can see, in Canada's decision to ban in April 2006 and the EU's decision to ban in May 2006. Pre 9/11, the same law was in place. The difference is there was not a state practice to extraterritorially apply domestic terrorism prosecution. I know all of this is a mouthful, but the one-line summary is if the conflict was reclassified, the Canada ban and the EU bans would possibly violate provisions of international humanitarian law, specifically Protocol 1, Article 1.4 of the Geneva Convention, which is the self-determination issue. So if an armed conflict is an armed conflict for the exercise of self-determination, that's one provision that can reclassify. But what we've seen, just looking back, this legal issue was avoided. And as such, the terrorism laws and extraterritorial application of the terrorism laws are permissible. So that's the first point that I wanted to bring out. We can revisit that in the questions. I know that's a lot to take in. The second point, in 2006, there was a US Supreme Court case called Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project. And it basically held that peace education can be classified as material support to terrorism. And the focus on the Canada bans is to criminalize uses of force by the LTTE, in the context of the low-intensity armed conflict that unfolded during the peace process, right? Because it was, look, we're going to put the bans, it bans LTT. The bans also criminalize, Norway's involvement and the entire peacekeeping mission. And so these are legal issues that are unlikely to find much traction in the political arena until they are, further explored in the legal dimension. And the broader question is, can you use a domestic terrorism ban to disrupt or collapse an ongoing international peace process? This question has yet to be answered. The third point I wanted to raise is, I think, just living in the West, part of the global war on terror paradigm is this notion of fighting democracy. Promoting democracy and fighting terrorism. And one way that model can go sideways is May 2009, where you can see that Sri Lanka held elections while it was pounding the no-fire zone and attacking hospitals, and everything that happened in the no-fire zone ran in parallel to elections, and that part is essentially censored out of the Western narrative. So these were the 3 points that I wanted to cover about the general timeline. And now I'll share the last slide that I have. Okay. Okay, so I'll just go through this one by one. Harmonization is a legal term of art that basically means, in the current situation, multiple bodies of law apply, and harmonization essentially consolidates the, how the duties, obligations, privileges, liberties, how these are distributed and balanced. It harmonizes it into one rule that's like coherent and easy to follow. The term of art harmonization of law is used, for example, in the European Union to basically make sure there's consistency across, for example, the tax codes of different EU member states. When we look at wartime delisting, and we look at the intersection of armed conflict with the war on terror, with human rights, with civil liberties, and all of these things, at least from my read, we essentially have a harmonization problem where multiple bodies of law may plausibly apply. If you look at Sri Lanka, when there's zero enforcement mechanism, these multiple bodies of law harmonize to zero law. If you had to run it through a binary classifier, 0-1, does individual X have certain rights or not? I think the general correlation I've seen is where there is an encroachment or advance of Western counterterrorism interests, you see other laws, basically tend to zero. From drone strikes in Syria to bombing of hospitals in Yemen to the killing field in May 2009. And so in this fog of law, it's very easy to do pretty bad things with no consequences. So there's a harmonization problem, and this, in my view, contributed to May 2009. The second point about ban coverage, again, this is something that I think is broader than the Sri Lankan context, but I'll explain how I've seen it working regarding delisting efforts since May 2009, and how it impacted certain legal strategy decisions in my advice to Canadian groups. So, let me back up. So, during the Cold War, Sovietology was an ideology created to essentially advance Western national security interests and everything that trickled down from that, whether it's conducting war in a certain place or creating lists of communists and then mobilizing criminal law enforcement behind that, right? There was an ideology for that. And I think what we've seen generally in the last 2 decades since 9/11 is you see counterterrorism, continue to evolve. In parallel, we see counter-radicalization, which is sort of like a child of counterterrorism. And so this comes up in the delisting. In, let's say, in 2020, there's an effort to delist the LTT in Canada. Now, we have in May 2009 a fundamental change in circumstances, right? Whereas the LTTE had one organizational structure pre-May 2009, and then it's unclear. We know the acronym is on the law books, but whether or not an organization exists as a functional matter, we can reasonably conclude one does not. And yet the bans have been renewed multiple times. The UK and the EU have renewed the bans. The US has renewed the bans. And from the perspective of legal representation, in terms of a terrorism prescription, in any government, the national security establishment and executive branch, their power is at the peak. So if you are trying to delist and you engage the original ban, your probability of delisting is probably small. Even if there were the original listing, breached various provisions of international law, just how the national security bubble works on determinations by the judiciary and the executive, you would probably be better off focusing on attacking a renewal of the ban, as was done in the EU, where the argument is, look, the armed conflict ended. Now there's no more need for the ban, so you should delist. And the EU effort was successful on that ground. Now, this same argument failed in the UK. And then in assessing a similar argument, meaning post-May 2009, the war's over, let's delist. In assessing the same argument in Canada, I've had to raise the question, will it work? Will it work? And after I looked at Canada's definition of the LTT, they basically added the word diaspora. They added the word diaspora to the LTT definition post-May 2009. And what the diagram in this section B tries to cover is pre-May 2009. Basically, there was a model where the diaspora and the LTT were related. The LTT was a centralized hierarchical network like an army that ran a de facto government pre-May 2009. And so I think the Western bands focused on the LTT, and there was discussion of, I see a raised hand. Am I running out of time?
Yes, if you can summarize it a little bit.
Yeah, I'll wrap up. So, so in terms of part B, the main shift is pre-May 2009. The bands targeted the LTT as an organization. Post-May 2009, the ban essentially covers the diaspora. In Canada, it's more complicated than that, but I'll wrap that up. Tamil nationalism is the common link between terrorism, genocide, and self-determination. Self-determination is for Tamil nationalism. Genocide protects the Tamil national group, and the current definition of the LTTE essentially uses Tamil nationalism as membership logic. So that's that point. That's of course a more in-depth topic. And the fourth point is the concrete impact of the ban. Let's say just on the Canadian Tamil diaspora. One is criminal stigma. Two, the ban directly impacts immigration outcomes. Tamils have separate but equal access to Canadian immigration laws, which are still analyzed as if it was the year 2000. And then you have civil liberties and obstacles to justice for May 2009. That's it.
Thank you, Rajiv, for sharing your knowledge there. And next, we have a recorded presentation from Mr. Lorenzo Fiorchio, who is a lawyer and advocate for Elam Tamil human rights. He has written for community media on Tamil issues for a decade and has participated in lobbying efforts of the United Human Rights Council. He holds an LLM in International Dispute Resolution. The topic for discussion would be the state of Tamil Elam as a subject of international law, its status and rights at the ICJ.
Hello to those watching in North America, the UK, and Europe, and my particular thanks to those watching from occupied Tamil Elam. My name is Lorenzo. I am Tamil, born and raised in Canada, and I'm a lawyer in the UK. I am pleased to see my Prime Minister Rudra Kumaran, present today. I am also pleased to note many other renowned experts at this conference, including Professor Peter Schock and Dr. Alfred Desaias, along with many other important figures in the Tamil cause. My topic today is very simple. Tamil Elam already exists as a separate state in international law. The Tamil people have voted in the 1977 Sri Lanka elections on a mandate to create a separate state. From that vote onwards, the state has existed in law, succeeding to the territorial title of Tamil kings before colonization. It was openly recognized by Sri Lanka in 2003, and not even Sri Lanka's slaughter of its government in 2009 has extinguished the state. The state of Tamil Elam, in its own name, can take this argument to the International Court of Justice in The Hague and have it confirmed. De facto states who have not signed the ICJ statute have standing to appear at the ICJ as long as they deposit the appropriate letters with the ICJ registrar. My time is short, so I will get directly to the point. The Montevideo Convention is considered to be customary international law on statehood. Customary international law means that states are required to follow it, whether or not they have actually said they would do so in writing. The Montevideo Convention says that there are 4 conditions to become a state. First, permanent population. Second, defined territory. Third, government. And fourth, capacity to enter into relationships with other states. So let's compare this to what the Tamil people voted on in the Vaticord Resolution and the 1977 TULF Election Manifesto. Population. Here's the Vaticord Resolution. The state of Tamil Eelam shall consist of the people of the northern and eastern provinces, and shall also ensure full and equal rights of citizenship of the state of Tamil Eelam to all Tamil Tamil-speaking people living in any part of Ceylon, and to Tamils of Eelam origin living in any part of the world who may opt for citizenship of Tamil Eelam. The TULF Election Manifesto also used this definition. It was voted on and approved by the people in 1977. Territory. Here is the TULF Election Manifesto. The territory stretching in the western seaboard from Chilao through Puttalam to Mannar and thence to the northern regions and in the east, Trincomalee and also the Vaticord regions that extended southwards up to Kumana, or to the northern banks of the river Kumbhakanoya, were firmly established as the exclusive homeland of the Tamils. This is the territory of Tamil Eelam. We have voted on our territory. Combined with historic habitation from immemorial times to the present day, this vote established legal title to that territory. Government. The TULF manifesto stated that the Tamil-speaking representatives who get elected through these votes, while being members of the National State Assembly of Ceylon, will also form themselves into the National Assembly of Tamil Eelam, which will draft a constitution for the state of Tamil Eelam and to establish the independence of the Tamil Eelam by bringing that constitution into operation, either by peaceful means or by direct action or struggle. The 1977 elections returned 18 members of the Tamil United Liberation Front to the Sri Lankan Parliament, sweeping the historically Tamil northeast region of the island. The 18 TULF MPs were the government of the new state of Tamil Eelam. Capacity to enter into relations with other states. As we just saw, the TULF MPs were simultaneously members of the Sri Lankan Parliament, as well as forming the government of Tamil Eelam. They could enter into relations with other states. There you have it. From 1977 onwards, Tamil Eelam fulfilled every condition of the Montevideo Convention. I do not have time for arguments on how Tamil Eelam has maintained its continuity from 1977 to the present, but I have made them in my paper. Article 1 of the ICCPR and ICESCR, both UN conventions, guarantee the right of self-determination to peoples. Are Eelam Tamils a people? In a General Assembly document written by Dr. Desaias, A/69/272, we read, participants at a UNESCO expert meeting on self-determination endorsed what has been called the Kirby definition, recognizing as a people a group of persons with a common historical tradition, racial or ethnic identity, cultural homogeneity, linguistic unity, religious or ideological affinity, territorial connection, or common economic life. The Vaticord Resolution helps us establish that we are a people in the Kirby definition. We obviously are a group of persons. We hold a common historical tradition with a recorded literary history of at least 2,000 years. We call ourselves Eelam Tamils, and so we hold a common ethnic identity. In our daily life, traditional dress, cooking, and so on, we show cultural homogeneity. As speakers of the Tamil language, especially in its Eelam variety, we hold linguistic unity. The Vaticord Resolution and Eelam Tamil social practice enshrine a secular society respecting Hindus, Muslims, and Christians. Eelam Tamils hold ideological affinity based on the principles of nationhood, homeland, and self-determination. Now, as we've seen, the Vaticord Resolution and TULF Manifesto declare a demographic claim of the Eelam Tamil population to the contiguous northern and eastern regions of the island of Ceylon, indicating territorial connection. Eelam Tamils are demonstrably bound together, both within their national territory and worldwide, by commercial, charitable, and familial economic ties. Eelam Tamils therefore fulfill each condition constituting a people under the Kirby definition. As such, the Ilam Tamil people holds the right of self-determination under ICCPR Article 1. Dr. Desai has stated that to the Kirby conditions should be added the will to be identified as a people. The Vaticord Resolution specifically mentions the Ilam Tamil people's will to exist as a separate entity, ruling themselves in their own territory, a nation distinct and apart from the Sinhalese. Ilam Tamils are a people. They were a people in 1977, and they had the right in international law to vote on self-determination. Was it clear what the people were voting for? The TULF election manifesto said, the Tamil United Liberation Front views the forthcoming general election as an opportunity to obtain the mandate of the Tamil nation and on the basis of its right to self-determination, re-establish the independence of the state of Tamil Ilam, the expression of the sovereignty of the Tamil nation. The Tamil people exercised its right of self-determination under ICCPR and ICSCR Article 1 by voting to form a new state. And in that vote, they fulfilled each one of the legal conditions laid out in the Montevideo Convention. Let us not forget that Dante Chelva was a trained barrister. The Vaticord Resolution and TULF election manifesto were written with the law of nations in mind. Was there any law stopping the Tamil people's declaration of independence? In paragraph 122 of the ICJ's Kosovo decision, the ICJ concluded that the adoption of the Declaration of Independence of 17 February 2008 did not violate general international law, Security Council resolution, or the constitutional framework. Consequently, the adoption of that declaration did not violate any applicable rule of international law. Thus, the Kosovo opinion upheld the principle that unilateral declarations of independence by themselves violate no rule of international law, nor had that particular unilateral declaration violated the domestic constitution. The same is true of Tamil Ilam. The Sixth Amendment to Sri Lanka's constitution, which bans advocacy of secession, was not passed until 1983. Back in 1977, the TULF had even greater legitimacy than the drafters of the Kosovo Declaration of Independence from Serbia, as Tamil Ilam acted entirely within the constitutional authority of the Sri Lankan Parliament. Paragraph 80 of the Kosovo opinion stated that the argument of territorial integrity does not apply in cases of self-determination. Sri Lanka cannot claim territorial integrity to violate the Tamil people's right of self-determination. In the 1977 general election, the electoral referendum, the Tamil people exercised their rights with full legality at the national and international levels. This act formed the state of Tamil Ilam and established its legal title to the territory of the traditional homeland of the Tamil people. We then read in The Hindu, in an article by Amit Barua on 11 April 2003, that the Sri Lankan president, Chandra Kumaratunga, has said that the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Ilam, Ltte, has established a de facto separate state in the north of her country and in parts of the east since entering into peace talks with the Ranil Wickremesinghe government. Kumaratunga's statement was a clear act of tacit recognition, one that falls within the scope of the Montevideo Convention, Article 7. Under Article 6 of the Montevideo Convention, Sri Lanka's recognition may not be withdrawn, for it is unconditional and irrevocable. But what about May 18, 2009? What of the genocide and the destruction of Tamil Ilam state structures? UN General Assembly Resolution 3314, which expresses customary international law on the crime of aggression, cites invasion, attack, annexation, and occupation as different forms of the crime of aggression. This crime has never been heard in a court, as far as I know. However, customary international law also states that conditions of belligerent occupation remove the Montevideo Convention's requirement for a state to have a government. James Crawford is one of many scholars who says this, and I quote, "International law does distinguish between change of state personality and change of the government of the state. There is a strong presumption that the state continues to exist with its rights and obligations, despite revolutionary changes in government, or despite a period in which there is no or no effective government." belligerent occupation does not affect the continuity of the state, even where there exists no government claiming to represent the occupied state. The legal position of governments in exile is dependent on the distinction between government and state, end quote. So, the Hague Regulations describe Sri Lanka's military presence on the territory of Tamil. Article 42 of the 1907 Hague Regulations, annexed to the Fourth Hague Convention, reads, "Territory is considered occupied when it is actually placed under the authority of the hostile army. The occupation extends only to the territory where such authority has been established and can be exercised." The ICJ applied Article 42 in the Palestine Wall decision and in the armed activities dispute between the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Uganda. Similarly, in 1959, the ICJ ruled on the question of whether Belgium has lost its sovereignty by non-assertion of its rights and by acquiescence in acts of sovereignty alleged to have been exercised by the Netherlands at different times since 1843. It found by a majority vote that despite more than 100 years of occupation, Belgium had retained its sovereignty over the disputed territory. Once again, in the right of passage over Indian territory case, the ICJ tribunal ruled that a 1779 treaty signed between Portugal and the Marathi Kingdom prior to British colonization of India still applied in 1960. This treaty, the court held, gave Portugal a right of passage in parts of present-day India. Despite his dissenting opinion, Judge Quintana wrote, "When it became independent, India made no fundamental change in the established system. We must not forget that India, as the territorial successor, was not acquiring the territory for the first time, but was recovering an independence lost long since. Its legal position at once reverted to what it had been more than 100 years before, as though the British occupation had made no difference." Thus, it would appear that both the court's judgment and Judge Quintana's dissent agreed. India, when it ceased to be a colony of Great Britain, reverted to its pre-colonial status of sovereignty, despite more than 100 years of occupation. If the ICJ or any other court were to recognize Sri Lanka's claim to the occupied territory of Tamil, it would create legal relations out of state crimes. There is a Latin maxim of international law that means law cannot arise from injustice. So what next? The ICJ has established that de facto states can appear before the court, even without recognition. The State of Israel was the first to have this status in the 1949 reparation for injuries case. Israel was not recognized at that time. The same goes for the 1993 Bosnian genocide case. The scholar Jure Vidmar writes, "The FRY, or Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, appeared before the International Court of Justice in the Bosnia genocide case, and the court established that the case was admissible, although the FRY was universally non-recognized at that time. The position of the ICJ thus clearly shows that recognition is not necessary for an entity to be considered as a state." UN Security Council Resolution 9, 1946, paragraph 1 reads, "The International Court of Justice shall be open to a state which is not a party to the statute of the International Court of Justice, upon the following condition, namely that such state shall previously have deposited with the registrar of the court a declaration by which it accepts the jurisdiction of the court in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations and with the terms and subject to the conditions of the statute and rules of the court, and undertakes to comply in good faith with the decision or decisions of the court, and to accept all the obligations of a member of the United Nations under Article 94 of the Charter." What are those obligations? Article 94 of the Charter says, "Each member of the United Nations undertakes to comply with the decision of the International Court of Justice in any case to which it is a party. And if any party to a case fails to perform the obligations incumbent upon it under a judgment rendered by the court, the other party may have recourse to the Security Council, which may, if it deems necessary, make recommendations or decide upon measures to be taken to give effect to the judgment." So, those are the obligations created for UN member states that Tamil also needs to abide by in order to benefit from the same standing at the ICJ. This means that the occupied state of Tamil must do the following in order to appear before the ICJ. First, The state of Tamil Eelam should deposit a declaration with the registrar of the ICJ that it accepts the court's jurisdiction, either for the specific question to be resolved or in general, under the UN Charter and the ICJ statute, and accepts the terms and rules of the court. Second, the declaration should undertake to comply in good faith with the decision or decisions of the court under UNSC Resolution 9, 1946. Third, the declaration should submit the state of Tamil Eelam to its adversary's recourse to the UN Security Council if it should fail to uphold the court's decision under UNSC Resolution 9, 1946. There's no longer any question in my mind. The state of Tamil Eelam has every right to be heard at the ICJ. It may litigate Sri Lanka's state responsibility for war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and aggression. This includes the ongoing military occupation, where the Oakland Institute has reported that there is one Sri Lankan soldier for every 6 Tamil civilians in the territory of Tamil Eelam. This also means that the soldiers of Tamil Eelam were not a terrorist organization, they were a national defense force. Now, things do happen. States have ignored the ICJ's rulings before without any consequences at the Security Council. The state of Tamil Eelam might deposit its registration with the ICJ registrar, and then the paperwork could mysteriously disappear into a black hole. Stranger things have happened. To prevent this, we need the informal support of ICJ member states. There is no doubt about this. My paper also describes the continuity of the state of Tamil Eelam from 1977 to the present day, the UN's failure to protect this Tamil state from Sri Lanka's crimes, why the conflict between Tamil Eelam and Sri Lanka was an international armed conflict, why foreign state recognition is not decisively important in international law, and 2 different kinds of judicial recognition that are possible at the ICJ, an advisory opinion or jurisdiction rationale persona. I did not have time for those discussions today, but please feel free to ask me. But let me repeat, in international law, Tamil Eelam is an occupied but sovereign state. It fulfills every one of the Montevideo Convention's conditions. In order to gain international judicial recognition, the state of Tamil Eelam must communicate in writing to the ICJ registrar that it is willing to be bound by the ICJ's rulings under the authority of the UN Charter and the ICJ statute, and that it is willing to be referred to the UN Security Council if it breaks an ICJ ruling. It can use that judicial recognition to litigate Sri Lanka's state responsibility for a long list of crimes. But most importantly to us today, it can litigate the crime of aggression in the form of the ongoing military occupation of Tamil Eelam's territory. Brothers and sisters, it is my argument that in international law, through the Vaticord Resolution of 1976 and the electoral referendum of 1977, you and I are citizens of the sovereign state of Tamil Eelam. Even military occupation cannot change this fact, for law cannot arise from injustice. I want to end with a quote by a man who was born on November 26, 1954, and was killed on May 18, 2009. He said, "Do not live your lives feeling, I am great or you are great, but lead your lives feeling that our nation is greater than all of us, that we are all smaller than that nation, and that far more than our impermanent lives, it is the life of the nation that is greater. The sacrifices of the generations going before us are a testament to our enduring nobility, not just as a people, but as a sovereign state. As long as we continue to boldly assert our statehood, our state of Tamil Eelam remains alive in the law of nations." Thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. And following is another recorded segment. This is by Mr. Jack McLaren. He's a Canadian former politician who represented the Eastern Ontario riding of Carleton, Mississippi Mills in the Legislative Assembly of Ontario from 2011 to 2018. He's past president of the Ontario Landowners Association and graduated with a BSc in Civil Engineering from Queen's University in 1972. The topic of his speech is "The terrorist designation is a black cloud hanging over the heads of Tamil Canadians." Following this is the last segment for our evening. We will have a plenary discussion by Professor Joseph Chandra and the other speakers. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Jack McLaren.
My name is Jack McLaren. I am a former member of provincial parliament in the province of Ontario. I was the liaison at that time between the PC Party of Ontario and the Tamil people of Ontario. I came to know many Tamils who are living in Canada. I have learned about their struggle for freedom and self-determination in Sri Lanka, which is their homeland. I have learned about the terrible civil war in Sri Lanka that ended in defeat for the Tamil people, whose liberation fighting forces were decimated at the end of the civil war in 2009. Canada wrongfully designated the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam as terrorists in 2006. The Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam are freedom fighters, not terrorists. Now, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam are gone. They were annihilated in 2009. They will never be a force again. The terrorist designation still exists in Canada. This designation is a large and oppressive black cloud over the heads of Tamil people in Canada. This stigmatization prevents Tamil people from being able to freely stand up and be proud of their history, their culture, and their rightful place in Canadian civilization. But the terrorist designation still exists in Canada. This designation is a large and oppressive black cloud over the heads of Tamil people in Canada. This stigmatization prevents Tamil people from being able to freely stand up and be proud of their history, their culture, and their rightful place in Canadian society. It is time to correct the wrong. It is time for Canada to remove the terrorist designation from the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. It is time for Canada to recognize Tamil people as good citizens and good neighbors.
Shiva, நீங்க ஓகேயா?
Chandra and then we'll start, I guess. Maybe please unmute.
If you have any questions, please say the name of the person to whom you're directing it and make it brief so that we could have a short discussion for about 10 to 15 minutes and we'll conclude it by 6:15. Unmute your microphone as you ask the questions.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question to Rudrakumaran, Prime Minister, is regarding the political status of the delisting. Delisting of LTT, and he said that this is a political matter which had to be this is a political matter which has to be dealt but not through the courts. I am not clear about that, whether it is what other means we can do to delist LTT from the ban.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, Rudra.
Yeah, okay. No, I did not say that we cannot challenge legally. As I concluded in my remarks, I said litigation is also the continuation of politics by other means. So we have to use the judicial forum. And then, but what I'm saying is these are political considerations. The politics plays an important role in it. But we can also check, doesn't necessarily mean that the courts are powerless. But so what I would propose, we have to do both simultaneously. While we pursue this action in the courts, we also have to mobilize our people and to engage in political action. And especially in Canada, since we have a large number of Tamil people there, where we have a voting strength, I think if we can mobilize the voting power in Canada, and also and through that also we can pressurize the politicians to remove the Ltte from the list. So our position is we have to pursue both simultaneously. We have to pursue the legal action as well as the political action. And the legal action also, again, I would like to emphasize, is a litigation, is the continuation of politics through other means. Thank you.
Next question in line, Tharmarajan.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening to you all. Thank you for this wonderful, participation. I would like to ask Red Grow. I am very impressed with his statement. Yeah, it's true. I mean, we never want to, armed struggle or whatever. Every attempt made and it's all failed, but our solution is not done yet. So instead of Ltte, you can forget about Ltte now. Our rights has to be restored. So India is the main element, I believe. So how we can convince them, because we are very flexible on their stand all the time as the political leaders back home. So as a diaspora, what action further we can take? I believe on step-by-step basis. Thank you.
I believe that question was to Mr. Ruthukmaran.
Yeah, to answer your question, yes. I mean, there's obviously a lot of geopolitical issues, I think, which will arise in the future, especially regarding China and their work with the Sinhalese government, whether India will counter that by working with, Tamils in northern or Tamil Eelam. I would correct the idea, though, that the Ltte is gone. I would dispute that to the extent that I think that there still exists an Ltte throughout the diaspora and throughout Tamil Eelam itself. And if the conditions are not changed, then it will just arise again. Essentially, that the history of all sort of armed resistance movements shows that it might have another name or it might rename itself, but the armed struggle will exist as long as the oppression exists, unless you have just sort of an outright genocide where everyone is killed. But I do think in international law, there's a legal right for India to arm the Tamils in Tamil Eelam if they wish, in the same way that the Chinese government is assisting the Sri Lankan government. You can't have a situation where only the state itself can receive foreign assistance, but the resistance against that state cannot. So that's what I would say to that.
Thank you.
Next, Maga Ramakrishnan.
I have a question for Jaya Gopinath. What do you think Sri Lanka will do to counter the diaspora's efforts to lift the Ltte ban? Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, good. My opinion is that always Sri Lankan diplomats I have shown in my presentation earlier, they are always ahead of us. we are always talking about, we are now talking about 13th Amendment and Indo-Lanka Agreement, but they are much ahead of us. So what they are planning now is to bring LTTE ban as a UN ban, universal ban. They are dealing with the US, they are dealing with India, they are dealing with China. They are using the balancing act to get the LTTE ban implemented at UN Security Council as equal to Al-Qaeda and easy. So it is very important to challenge the original ban and if possible to bring the case as an advisory opinion case or something like that to International Court of Justice. For example, was the decision done correctly to ban the LTTE in the United States, in the EU, in Canada? How are all these connected? We can get one of the countries to create a state dispute on that or something like that to go ahead and get an advisory opinion or something like that. So we have to pursue all the avenues, and we have to be mindful that Sri Lankans are always ahead of us. And with regard to the political solution, they are using India. With regard to LTT ban, they are going to use the West. That's my reaction. Thank you.
Next in line, Pratika Sitsabisa.
Hi, thank you. My question is for Mr. Fiorito. You spoke, your argument was brilliant, except I have a question about the crux of your argument. You spoke mainly based on the Montevideo Convention of 1934. It came into force 1934, of which there are only 16 states that have ratified the Montevideo Convention. And of those 16 states, Sri Lanka is not one of them. Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, USA, and Venezuela. So how does your argument actually, how does it make any sense if Sri Lanka is actually not a signatory or that didn't actually ratify the Montevideo Convention? How does it apply to Sri Lanka?
The question was directed to Mr. Taro, right?
No, I believe it was Fiorito.
May I say something?
Yes, please.
Yeah, means we can argue that the convention has attained the state of customary international law. Therefore, even though Sri Lanka is not a party to the convention, they are still bound by the customary international law. So that argument can be advanced.
That is exactly correct. There is a short answer and a scholarly answer to this. The short answer is that yes, the Montevideo Convention is considered a university to codify the pre-existing customary international law on the question of statehood. So this was not only state practice, but also state practice in the belief that they were following law for quite an extended period before these principles were written down in the Montevideo Convention. And the state practice has been borne out since the ratification of that convention through, for example, the arbitration on the states succeeding the former Yugoslavia, where we have the Vaticord Commission that says that a state is independent. Its existence is independent of recognition. This is exactly what is called the declaratory method of achieving statehood. You fulfill these four conditions, you are a state. It doesn't matter if anybody is recognized. And Beyond this, there was previously in international law the constitutive method, which was based on the idea of recognition. That is today considered to be an outmoded way of viewing statehood. Recognition is no longer considered a criterion to be a state.
Thank you. I think Mr. Manivandan and Maha had another question. You want to take it? Manivandan?
Yeah, I would like to again ask Prime Minister Ratnakumaran. The Lorenzo has said that the convention, like it's not convention, sorry, the declaration in 1976, the Watercolor Declaration and the 1977 following referendum can be taken up with the ICJ. Is there any possibility that the TGT can do something on that line?
That was a very creative argument that maybe I will contact him also. Yeah, we can, when we have to create some new forums and some precedents, because there is no, to my knowledge, there is no precedent to that argument that he made. But we are not bound, because as I always say, that we are not bound by any precedents because we create precedents. So I think, yeah, I was very much interested, and we can explore that possibility. In fact, I think maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we passed a resolution. Probably you might know, at that time you were also in the TGT. We passed a resolution to submit ourselves to the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, ICC. So in fact, we also drafted a declaration, and we thought of sending it to the ICC registrar, saying that we would like to we ratify the Rome Statute, and we would like to be a member of the Rome Statute and subject ourselves to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. So along that line, I think Lawrence also made an argument that ICJ. Now we'll take into consideration. I am very much intrigued, and then we'll see what we can do on this matter. Thank you.
We can take one last question.
Yeah, that is Maka Ramakrishnan.
My question is to Rajiv Sridharan. Do you think we should concentrate more on why the LTT ban was wrong, and especially it was unjust to LTT, compared to just focusing on removing the ban because LTT, the organization, is no more?
Yeah, so this was an issue that was contemplated when we did the EU ban, and it's now under consideration for the delisting proceeding in Canada. And there's pretty much two strategic choices. You can, as you stated, you can focus on the renewal, or you can focus on the renewal and the legality of the original ban. Now, if we take the EU, and I also agree with Rudran, we can't reason by analogy, because there are no precedents. We have to reason up from the truth to what is right. And so if we take the EU proceeding as the precedent for what's explored in Canada or other jurisdictions, in the EU, we basically focused on post-May 2009. The argument was, the war is over, so let's delist. And this argument in theory gets stronger with each year that passes. Now, what happened was the EU delisted on technical grounds, and then it relisted, relying on the UK ban. And the issue, the underlying root issue, this is my opinion, is pretty much the ban acronym, these 4 letters, LTTE, it's not descriptive. Pre-May 2009, it referred to a factual group, and the argument was in May 2009, this group changed, or it ended, or however you want to call it, and now we should delist, right? That's a descriptive view of the acronym. But my hypothesis, which I think is validated by Canada changing its definition of who is an LTT member, is the definition is ascriptive. So LTT is whoever the West wants the LTT to be. And in that sense, I have been advising we should basically make both arguments. There's no need to choose between one or the other. In my personal opinion, in Canada, if we make only the post-May 2009 argument, we'll probably get the same results that we've seen in the EU and the UK, that you're going to find absence of evidence to support the Canada ban. You'll get some sort of technical ruling where the court is concerned that Canada didn't provide enough evidence to continue to renew it. And then if the US, UK, and Canada decide, look, we need to keep the LTT ban, they'll keep it. And so that's why I think there is merit in also engaging the legality of the original ban, which will include all these, which will include all the self-determination arguments that we discussed. So yeah, so I think we need to do both. Did that answer your question, or?
Okay, I think we'll bring this to a conclusion, and thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. It's not easy on a Friday evening to sacrifice your family time and to be here. So I thank you for your presence and participation, and especially I wish to thank all the speakers for the beautiful and very powerful insights that you brought into this conference from the legal, political, social, and other angles. We shall all meet tomorrow at 9 a.m. Toronto time or Eastern Standard Time. So we'll start the second session of the conference tomorrow at 9 a.m. Thank you very much and have a good night, all of you.